today in terms of clarification?
Nora, that's what's so interesting. It was yesterday, after only approximately 4 hours of deliberating, that the jurors had notes for the judge. They needed instruction from the judge on what it meant to infer something. They also wanted instructions as to how to value Michael Cohen's testimony, considering he was an accomplice to this alleged crime. They also wanted 4 additional pieces of testimony as it related to David Pecker, a close confidant, and someone who testified that he's still a friend of Trump and considers him a mentor. And they had questions about testimony relating to a Trump Tower meeting in August of 2015, which the prosecution says was the nexus, the core, the origins of a scheme to deceive the American public by suppressing negative stories about Donald Trump in the tabloids, amplifying negative stories about his opponents to effectively pave the way for him to the White House. They wanted clarification on that. And what's interesting is when the judge clarified that because Michael Cohen is an accomplice, you cannot convict based on his testimony alone unless it is corroborated by other evidence and testimony as part of the trial. Also, he clarified to them that they can infer something. Basically, he used the analogy of if it rained overnight. Even if you didn't see the rain, you can infer that it rained overnight if you can see outside your window in the morning and people have umbrellas and the pavement is wet. So even in the absence of direct fact, you can make an inference as a jury if other facts seem to suggest and reasonably line up another scenario. And so as we await to hear what the exact verdict is, we are now, I understand, inside the courtroom with jurors seated, with Donald Trump looking quite anxious. We're getting word of what the verdict is.
We are getting word on the first count that Donald Trump is guilty. Now remember, there are 34 counts that we will go through. Count 2, guilty. Count 3, guilty. Count 4, guilty. Count 5 and 6, guilty. Count 7, guilty. Count 8, guilty. Count 9, guilty. Count 10, guilty. Count 11, guilty. Count 12, guilty. Count 13, guilty. Count 14 and 15, guilty. Count 16, guilty. Remember, this is a unanimous decision by the jury on each of these counts. Count 17, guilty. Count 18, guilty. Count 19, guilty. Count 20, guilty. Count 21, guilty. Count 22, guilty. Count 23, guilty. Count 24, guilty. Count 25, guilty. Count 26, guilty. Count 27, guilty. Count 28, guilty. 29, guilty. Count 30, guilty. Count 31, guilty. Count 32, guilty. Count 33, guilty. Count 34, guilty. Donald Trump has been found guilty on all counts of falsifying business records in an attempt to cover up these alleged relationships in the New York hush money trial. It's an extraordinary moment.
Nora, to hear you read what you just read is a moment of enormous gravity for this country. We cannot overlook that. To hear that word, guilty, not just once, but 34 times about a former president of the United States in any context is completely uncharted territory. And there will be a raging debate across this country about the propriety of bringing these charges. But under our system, a grand jury heard the evidence. A grand jury rendered an indictment. And through all due process, the former president was accorded all due process rights. And a jury of his peers assembled in New York in this courthouse found him guilty on all charges. This is not just a legal moment for this country. It is not just a political moment for this country. It is a moment where everything about politics and law and our orientation to both are convulsed as never before.
Donald Trump has become the first former president ever convicted of a crime. I want to bring in Robert Costa, who has covered Donald Trump for a long time and written books about Donald Trump. I can only imagine what the former president is doing right now.
Nora, this is the conclusion of a trial, but it's only the beginning of a fight. I've already gotten new reporting from Trump's sources. They are planning to appeal this decision as much as they can, and they plan to mount a grievance war across the country. To echo what Major said, this is a moment of seriousness for the country on a legal, political, and democratic front, because you now have a presumptive Republican nominee who will be mounting an appeals process as he heads toward the Republican convention, and he has the Republican Party behind him. It was here in the park, steps away, that the Speaker of the House, second in line to the presidency, Mike Johnson, came here to say, we stand with Trump. So many have come here wearing red ties and saying that Trump is our candidate, regardless of whether he's convicted of a crime in New York City. Here in deep blue Manhattan right now, there were cheers that went up in the park around us as the conviction was made clear to the crowd that has been gathering here. But from Trump supporters across the country, there is anger and frustration right now. And Trump campaign officials are arguing this is going to make Trump stronger inside the party. But now, as a convicted felon, it could raise new questions about maybe not his nomination for the Republican Party, but Democratic sources really believe some swing voters in places like Michigan, Pennsylvania, in the suburbs across the country might start to say, do we really want to have a convicted felon in the White House? It's a tag that Trump can no longer escape.
It's an important, we're talking about a legal issue right now, but a political issue as well, as you point out. I want to go straight to Errol Barnett, who is right outside, who can give us a sense of what's happening there outside the courtroom. Errol?
Nora, two angles I can give you. Outside the courthouse, we're hearing some sense of cheering and people yelling guilty. The courthouse directly behind me, while our reporters inside are painting some of the color as the foreperson read out the verdict. It was very similar, Nora, to the way you read this out. It was quiet and somber inside the courtroom, with former President Donald Trump seated as the defendant, looking at the jury as the foreperson, leaning with his left arm on a railing and a right hand holding the microphone, slowly 34 times said guilty as the judge was asking for the jury's verdict on these felony counts. Then the judge asks the jury, is this accurate? Is this the proper reflection of your verdict? They said yes. And during this entire time, Donald Trump staring intently at each of the jurors, the lawyers standing with their hands clasped, and the jurors at this moment being thanked by the judge for their service. Judge Merchant acknowledging that these past 6 weeks have been stressful for them. Let's not forget, some jurors that were selected early dropped out and buckled under the pressure, the media spotlight, and the importance of the moment. But inside the courthouse, a somber moment as Donald Trump, former president of the United States, GOP presumptive nominee, had to sit and listen as a defendant as a jury of 12 of his peers found him guilty on all 34 felony counts. This was the moment that Donald Trump became a felon.
Errol Barnett, thank you so much. I want to bring in our legal panel. Again, former Manhattan Assistant District Attorney and CBS News legal contributor Rebecca Roiphe joins me again. And Rebecca, let's talk about this. Donald Trump is 78 years old, a first-time offender in the eyes of the New York court system. Will he go to jail? What do you think happens?
We really won't know until the sentencing. I think that, he's certainly not going to jail for the rest of his life on these counts, but there is a real possibility of some jail time. And of course, any jail time for somebody in his position of his age is a significant thing right now. One other thing that has struck me about this case is there has been so much criticism of the case. And in a way, this verdict does vindicate Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan District Attorney, who brought this and defended it as a case that is quite standard for New York and for Manhattan. And, of course, when all eyes are on our local justice system, sometimes things look unusual, bizarre, different. But in many ways, this is not as different from other cases as some people suggested it was. And the evidence, as we can tell from this quick, strong verdict, was fairly strong.
Rebecca, thank you. I want to bring in Caroline Pelosi. She's a criminal defense attorney and lecturer in law at Columbia Law School. And on that same point, Caroline, because I think people want to know not only what happens to Donald Trump, what happens in this presidential election, which is now 6 months from now. The question before the judge in terms of sentencing, prison time, or there could be probation, right? What are some of the things that the judge will consider?
Absolutely. It is within the judge's discretion. There is no mandatory minimum jail sentence for these crimes. I totally agree with Rebecca. This is a huge win for Alvin Bragg. This case had a long and winding road to get here. Remember, it was called the zombie theory. It just wouldn't die. It spanned over two different district attorneys. People resigned in protest for the ways that they felt about whether or not the case was being brought. But this will mark the beginning of a lengthy appellate process. I like to point to the Harvey Weinstein verdict being overturned. That took soup to nuts 4 years. Justice takes time. So there are many legal issues here that I think are ripe for review. I don't know that any will take the day, but certainly there are meritorious arguments to be made. But when you're thinking about potentially putting a presidential candidate in jail, there are some considerations to be had. But I would note he was not, a stellar defendant during this case. Those are aggravating factors. These issues with the gag order, his behavior throughout the trial, that could potentially be a factor in Judge Merchan's analysis of whether or not to impose jail time here. Also, things like remorse. It does not seem as though the former president is at all remorseful for any of these actions. We'll have to wait and see for the arguments that are made in the sentencing memoranda.
It's a good point, Caroline. As you note, Judge Merchan has found Donald Trump that violated his gag order 10 times during this trial. Caroline Pelosi, stand by. I want to bring in former Manhattan District Attorney Cy Vance, who first opened this investigation into former President Donald Trump in 2018, but left office before the charges were filed. Cy, good to see you. What's your reaction to today's verdict?
My reaction is a huge congratulations to the assistant DAs and to Alvin Bragg for the amazing job that they've done in trying what was a very difficult case, a complicated case. And I think from an outside perspective, because I wasn't in the courtroom, I think they tried it almost flawlessly. So it was an important case. And I congratulate them in the office. As you said, this case began. The Trump investigation began some time ago when I was district attorney. We had to go to the Supreme Court twice in order to get access to his financial and tax records. That led to, when I was in office, his indictment for the Trump company's indictment for tax crimes. And then as the case moved on, DA Bragg took it up and has succeeded in doing something very important.
We are watching now, just outside the courtroom, members of Trump's team coming out. Some of his lawyers, as well as his communication specialists. So my guess is they're trying to decide what to do next and whether we'll hear from Donald Trump himself. So I do want to ask you, though, given this verdict, do you see there are grounds for appeal? What could the timeline be?
Well, I think the appeals will happen whether there are grounds for them or not. I think there will be many claims by the Trump team for judicial errors, bias, errors in instruction. I think the appeals will come from all sides, but I think that by no means are those appeals certain to prevail. And at the moment, I think what we're seeing is a sad day in the sense that a former president has been convicted. A day we should celebrate, however, for the victory of the justice system and our jury system and our court system to be able to manage a case this significant and difficult. And I think it will ultimately, I hope, end up having a calming influence. But as I say that, I think really what we'll see next is what is the political reaction and how the political reaction will be managed over the next months.
And Cy, I want to just listen in here now because Donald Trump is approaching the cameras.
Are you worried about going to jail? This was a disgrace. This was a rigged trial by a conflicted judge who was corrupt. It's a rigged trial, a disgrace. They wouldn't give us a venue change. We were at 5% or 6% in this district, in this area. This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. But the real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people. And they know what happened here, and everybody knows what happened here. You have a Soros-backed DA and the whole thing. We didn't do a thing wrong. I'm a very innocent man, and it's okay. I'm fighting for our country. I'm fighting for our Constitution. Our whole country is being rigged right now. This was done by the Biden administration in order to wound or hurt an opponent, a political opponent. And I think it's just a disgrace. And we'll keep fighting. We'll fight till the end and we'll win because our country's gone to hell. We don't have the same country anymore. We have a divided mess. We're a nation in decline, serious decline. Millions and millions of people pouring into our country right now from prisons and from mental institutions, terrorists, and they're taking over our country. We have a country that's in big trouble. But this was a rigged decision right from day one with a conflicted judge who should have never been allowed to try this case, never. And we will fight for our Constitution. This is long from over. Thank you very much.
Why should voters vote for a convicted felon?
And there you have it. Donald Trump calling this a rigged trial. We're hearing from sources close to him they do plan to appeal. The sentencing, we have learned, is going to be on July 11th at 10 a.m., where the judge has discretion. Each of these counts, my understanding, can carry as much as 4 years of jail time, as well as thousands of dollars in fine. Just want to quickly fact check something that the former president said. Scott McFarlane is with us. Donald Trump has repeated that this was launched by the Biden administration, but we should just clarify that so that people don't think this is something that Joe Biden initiated.
This is a grand jury, and this is a jury of his peers who did the work in this prosecution adjudication. But it's not just Donald Trump, Nora. It's his allies. The House Speaker, Mike Johnson, has just released a statement saying Democrats cheered as they convicted the leader of the opposing party. Elise Stefanik, who chairs the House Republican Conference, said this is a Biden administration prosecution. Not only is this not federal, this is a local prosecution, but this is not a Democratic Party process. But that date really jumps out at me, Nora. July 11th for sentencing. That's 4 days before the Republican National Convention.
Wow.
Opens in Milwaukee, swing state. And to Scott's point, and we should not overlook this, Nora, the politics of this will rage from this moment forward. And those who support former President Trump will regard this as a New York matter and a Democratic matter, not an American matter. They will be offended by this, and they will, to the former president's point, try to rally their supporters and other like-minded Republicans and others on November 5th. The former president has a very serious legal problem. He is trying to remedy it through politics.
I want to bring in Robert Costa, who is there outside the courthouse. And Robert, you could hear how angry Donald Trump was in those comments. What are you learning?
Nora, just seconds ago, got off the phone with someone very close to former President Trump, said he was expressing his anger, his fury about this verdict. Even before it was read, he was predicting to associates that he believed that this trial was a disaster and that he was going to fight it all the way through appeal. He was already signaling to some of the top Republicans in the country in the past hour that regardless of what happened, he wanted them to be with him. He believed they would stand with him. And he is really preparing his allies, tell me just now, to fight this all the way and to use this as a political weapon against President Biden. The Justice Department not involved in this case. This is a case in Lower Manhattan. This was a jury comprised of 12 New Yorkers, people who are his peers in his home city of New York. At the same time, you're going to hear former President Trump constantly use this as a refrain that he was targeted by this trial, targeted by this prosecutor, and he is going to use his own channels of communication, whether it's social media, some kind of rally or speeches or other means to get his message out there without fact-checking and often without the bounds of normal discourse holding him in. But this is American politics today. He has helped to create and really spearheaded this environment we are in now. But I know from people who have been with him in the past hour that he is furious and that this is not just something he's going to leave to the lawyers. He wants to be out front now, and this country is going to see him out front all summer.
I want to bring back in former Manhattan District Attorney Cy Vance and give you the opportunity, sir, to respond to those charges that this case was a disgrace and that it was rigged and brought by the Biden administration.
Well, certainly the origins of this case, which was when I was district attorney, had nothing to do with the Biden administration. And I don't think anything changed with regard to DA Bragg taking over and developing his separate case out of where the case began with us. I think what you're going to, your panelists have got it completely right. This is now going to go into the streets. It's going to be a matter of politics. I think the president will take this to the Supreme Court, where I think he hopes that it will finally receive the kind of audience he wishes he had in a jury, and that's going to be taking some time. But it's a great day for the DA's office in Manhattan. I'm proud of their work. I'm proud to be associated with the office. And I think this is a controversial case, but tough cases are controversial, and they did a fabulous job under a lot of pressure and under very bright lights in the public.
And Cy, explain that. How does a state case make its way up to the Supreme Court?
Well, the Supreme Court has issued rulings in many state cases. It will go through the state appeals process, and then after the Court of Appeals, assuming the courts of appeal in New York do not overturn the verdict, and former President Trump will take his best shot at each level and take his best hard shots, then they will appeal to the Supreme Court to accept certiorari, which is a fancy word meaning the Supreme Court agrees to hear the case. And that's the straight path, either through the state system or the federal system, where a defendant has the opportunity to at least ask the highest court in the land to consider reviewing the case.
Cy Vance, thank you. I want to bring in Jan Crawford, who covers the Supreme Court for us. Explain that process, but also, I mean, we're talking again, right? As Cy Vance noted, this will go to the streets, but there's still more to do in the courts, and we're still awaiting decisions from the Supreme Court as well on other matters.
Well, sure. The Supreme Court right now has two other cases involving former President Trump, but they're both related to the prosecution of Trump for his efforts, allegedly his efforts, to overturn the 2020 election here in Washington on January 6th, largely, and whether he's absolutely immune from prosecution for those actions. That's what the court's deciding now, and whether that case can even go forward. And if it can he be charged and other January 6 defendants be charged with obstruction? Major legal issues for the former president and, of course, the court to decide between now and the end of June. But right now, those are going to take a back seat because what many people had hoped to see, certainly Democrats had hoped to see, was a conviction of former President Trump, and they got that. So I think whether or not there was going to be a trial or not on the January 6 efforts.
All right. And I understand we've got some new information coming in from Ed O'Keefe, who is at the White House for us. Ed, what are you learning? Are we going to hear from President Biden?
We are not going to hear from President Biden, but we have a written statement from him, Nora. I'll explain why we won't in a moment. In his statement, he says, in New York today, we saw that no one is above the law. Donald Trump has always mistakenly believed he would never face consequences for breaking the law for his own personal gain. But today's verdict does not change the fact that the American people face a simple reality. There's still only one way to keep Donald Trump out of the Oval Office, at the ballot box. Convicted felon or not, Trump will be the Republican nominee for president. The threat Trump poses to our democracy has never been greater, the president says in his statement from his campaign. He says Trump, quote, is running an increasingly unhinged campaign of revenge and retribution, pledging to be a dictator on day one and calling for our Constitution to be terminated so he can regain and keep power. A second Trump term means chaos, ripping away Americans' freedoms and fomenting political violence, and the American people will reject it this November. The president is at his vacation home in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware today, marking the 9th anniversary of the death of his son, Beau. We saw him briefly this morning. in Wilmington, Delaware, at a church service with his family, and they stopped by a veterans memorial before he headed to that beach home. He's expected back here tomorrow for a few events for a few hours. His campaign and here at the White House, they have stressed that the president was likely to say something in some form, but not necessarily make a big deal of this. And isn't it telling that both the convicted former president and the sitting president have said the same thing, that ultimately the American people get to make this decision in November? Nora?
Ed O'Keefe at the White House, thank you. Want to go back outside the courthouse now to Robert Costa and Graham Cates, who have been covering this case so closely. Graham, I know you were inside, just made your way out. Give us a sense of what was happening, the mood there, and the demeanor of the individuals.
As the jurors walked in, neither Trump nor the jurors looked at each other, which is different than earlier in the day. Trump had usually stared and kind of studied the jurors. And then as the foreperson read for each count, guilty, 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 Trump stared straight ahead. He appeared emotionless. When he was finally excused from the proceeding, as he just began walking out, he kind of grabbed his son Eric's hand really briefly, and then with as deep of a frown as you've ever seen on Trump's face, walked slowly out of the room with his entourage behind him.
And
his family was there throughout so much of this. No, but Eric Trump, Donald Trump Jr. was here, but Eric Trump was also here for the civil fraud trial. For Trump, he ran a family company, all of these payments made through the Trump organization, his family there with him in the courtroom.
Yeah, Eric, more than anyone, throughout this trial and his civil fraud trial, came frequently on many days.
And Robert, I want to ask you, because we have now learned that this sentencing by Judge Merchan will be July 11th, and Donald Trump will be sentenced as a convicted felon 4 days before the Republican convention. Can you run a presidential race just on grievance alone? I mean, how will that change the dynamics, the contours of this race?
It's not going to change the contours of this race too much. I've spent a lot of time talking to officials in the Biden campaign and talking to Trump campaign officials, and they've made it clear to me on the Trump side that grievance is the fuel that helps Trump supporters really get aligned with him, even if they have concerns about his conduct or different policy positions. But Trump's also running a campaign concurrently against President Biden's record on the economy, about border security, railing against the president's policy on immigration. So in many respects, he's running a traditional Republican campaign, and that's why he has the Republican Party ensconced in his grip. He is someone who has the speaker, so many senators saying, "We're with you, Trump," nodding along. They almost forgive his grievance because they believe he's able to put together a coalition of populism, nationalism, and anger that will propel not only him to the White House, but them. And that's really the calculus here for so many Republicans at the highest level I'm speaking with. They're staying with Trump because they believe he still is, even as a convicted felon who might have a prison sentence as he approaches the Republican convention, he still is their path to power.
I think this is a good time to go through some of the basic questions that are out there, because Donald Trump said that the real verdict will be on November 5th. That is now 159 days away. Major, he can run for president as a convicted felon.
Absolutely.
Right. Can he vote?
Yes, because he's not, so he's not adjudicated fully because the appellate process goes on, so it's not over until it's over. And as Cy Vance indicated, that overness may take a considerable period of time because the former president will try to find every venue possible, legal, to reevaluate and possibly overturn this verdict.
And in reading
so until all that is done, he is a voter in good standing, to my understanding.
There are former prosecutors who said that it's unlikely that a 77-year-old former president, since this is his first offense in this court, would be sentenced to jail. But it could happen. But could he be elected president while serving prison time?
Well, obviously that's never happened, right? But there's nothing that we know of that would stop that from happening. And even if he doesn't go to jail, there's a number of other options available to this judge, including house arrest. So what does that mean for the campaign? It is almost inconceivable to kind of think about all, the road ahead for us now as this political campaign starts with a convicted felon that's potentially the Republican nominee.
And our polling division and election analysts, Anthony Salvanto, Kabir, others, know how difficult it has been, impossible, Nora, to actually gauge what people's reaction is going to be if there was a conviction. We now are in the first hours of the country absorbing this. And all these questions now overhang a presidential campaign in ways they didn't 1 hour ago. And when people think about this, some will be enraged, some will find solace that there is accountability institutionally in our country and our system works, our justice system works, and others are going to ponder, well, my goodness, what does this mean if he is elected? And those imponderables now are realities. And how people process that and then decide their voting behavior from that is unknown territory. But it begins in earnest this afternoon.
You know, he set the ground yesterday for this, saying that Mother Teresa wouldn't have even beaten these charges and the system was rigged. And people will believe that.
Some people will believe that, for sure.
There are a significant number of people will believe that. You look at polling that shows a complete erosion of faith in our institutions across the board. Many people say that Donald Trump caused some of that. But when you hear Republican leaders right now in the House and Senate issuing statements saying this is a travesty, this is a pro-Biden judge, this was rigged from the beginning, a significant number of American people will believe that.
You don't think it's a stretch to compare Donald Trump to Mother Teresa?
Well, you know, I mean, I didn't say that. I think he said that.
Yeah.
And there's going to be this process to try to discredit jurors. We've seen that in the previous prosecutions that are aligned to January 6th and the 2020 election, where they say it's a liberal jury in Washington, D.C., a liberal jury in Manhattan, almost like there's
it is a liberal jury in Manhattan. I mean, I think that's hard to argue with.
But for the moment the jurors met behind closed doors, you function as a jury. And the foreman had to get up, hold a microphone today, and announce a verdict against a former U.S. president. And there is always this concern. Anybody related with a nexus to a Trump case has the threat of being threatened, doxxed, or hassled.
But, Jan, those jurors also swore that they could be impartial.
Oh, absolutely.
So just to say that they're from a liberal area that votes liberally and votes Democratic does not mean that they did not promise under oath that they would be impartial.
And I certainly am not implying that. Yeah. I am saying that we have to acknowledge what the facts are, because those are facts that the American people are going to hear.
To Jan's point, inferences will be drawn.
Yeah.
Inferences in the political dialogue across this country will be drawn about the composition of this jury and the location of this case.
And the
inferences
judge.
Will be drawn.
And the judge, and why the case wasn't brought initially under the previous district attorney, and why the federal government didn't pursue these federal election charges against Trump. I mean, there's a number of questions that people are going to have. There's a number of questions that Trump is going to raise on appeal, starting from the very beginning with the indictment itself and how some of, what was some of those underlying object offenses. There are constitutional issues that he can raise. There is a lot there that he can use as this campaign unfolds to argue and point to that this entire prosecution was flawed from the get-go.
I think we all have a lot of questions, too, about what happens next, not only in the political arena, but also what happens to Donald Trump. So I do want to bring back in Caroline Polisi. She, Caroline, the judge, as we've noted, has wide discretion over the sentence here. But do you think that Judge Merchan will sentence the former president to prison?
I don't. I personally do not think that, look, for better or for worse, Trump has been treated like any other criminal defendant. The fact is, based on a reading of a lot of these types of cases, not many are actually sent to serve time. And so if you're treating the former president just like any other regular Manhattanite that would have been sentenced here, as a first-time nonviolent offender, it would be very unlikely that he would go to prison. I think that if he does get sentenced, that would just sort of add fuel to his fire in terms of acting as though he's being singled out here. So not to mention the fact that there would be issues with the Secret Service. He would not be with the general population. It would be a big burden on the prison system to have him there. So personally, I think that the objectives of sentencing can be accomplished through other forms of punishment, fines, probation, that type of thing. So I don't see it happening personally.
What do you think is the more likely sentence?
I think he will get a probationary sentence. I think that there will be fines to be, tied to the offense conduct in this case. Look, the the fact is it's not going to have any effect on his run for presidency from a legal perspective. Obviously, there's nothing in the Constitution that, says that he cannot run. On the voting part, he's registered to vote in Florida, and they do sort of concede to the state in which the potential felony has been adjudicated. And in New York State, any felon can vote as long as they're not currently incarcerated serving time. So if he doesn't serve any time, he will definitely be able to vote.
In researching and preparing for today, I did read, though, that if Donald Trump is sentenced to probation, he would be required to clear any out-of-state travel, such as campaign rallies or fundraisers, with a probation officer.
Well, that is absolutely true.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that can be done through staff and lawyers, but nevertheless, something we haven't seen before.
Absolutely. And that happens every day. I do that for my clients a lot, all the time. It is not fun dealing with probation, getting every little, detail of your life, really having them sign off on any time you want to travel. I do not see the former president, conceding lightly to this type of probationary sentence, but nonetheless, he will have to.
And then finally, Caroline, on grounds for appeal, what do you think Trump's attorneys could latch onto?
There are a lot of grounds for appeal here, starting with just the law, the statute under which the DA brought this case. There's been a lot said about this issue of unanimity among jurors. While the elements of the offense here were reached unanimously, there is this added little hook here that the object offense here, the New York State election law conspiracy, had to be done through quote unquote unlawful means. The jurors did not have to find unanimously with respect to what those unlawful means were. Remember, there were 3 presented to them: tax fraud, FICA violations, and other falsification of business records. I think there are potential due process issues in that statute. And then with respect to the jury instructions, they weren't allowed to bring them back with them. There will be questions on just how they arrived at their verdict. There is a lot here. I'm not convinced that any will take the day, but I do think that they are not frivolous arguments.
Carolyn, thank you. I just want to share with you what we're hearing from our Pat Milton, a producer out there, is that as soon as the verdict was released, the NYPD dramatically increased their presence there. You may have been able to hear as Robert Costa was speaking, or Errol Barnett, the NYPD helicopters flying overhead of the courthouse. Streets all locked down there. I think you still see the president's motorcade there. That's the shot there. There's some 100 mixed onlookers, protesters, supporters. There are Trump supporters there wearing red MAGA hats. They are gathered. So it is quite the scene in Manhattan there for this historic verdict. Just to remind everyone, just a short time ago, learning that this jury of 12 were unanimous in convicting Donald Trump on all 34 counts. And Donald Trump will be sentenced now on July 11th. That date's significant, certainly, as he will become a convicted felon just 4 days before the Republican National Convention. And Major, I'm wondering what happens now in the next couple of weeks. Donald Trump can now campaign freely, which he has had trouble doing because he has had to appear in court every day. Right. So he can travel the country. We don't know what will happen on July 11th, but if he's sentenced to probation, he could still be out there on the campaign trail.
He could still be out on the campaign trail, providing it's approved through all the probationary processes, which is also uncharted terrain. And in the one sense that I think this trial matters politically is that for the former president, every day at the courthouse was a day to prepare for this day. He knew that charges rendered against him could result in a guilty verdict. So how do you prepare for that? You don't prepare for it psychologically, not if you're former President Trump. You prepare for it politically. And seeding the clouds every single day with deep-seated questions about the process and the orientation of the judge, the jury, the proceedings around it, some of it completely without factual basis, some of it driven entirely by grievance, some of it completely ignoring the underlying facts, but some of it based on his own gut sense that if he were convicted, what he had to do in that intervening time, however long this trial took, was prepare his supporters for the idea that if it was a guilty verdict, it would be on its moment deemed fraudulent and offensive to them. That's the political terrain that the former president has occupied every single day of this trial. And it now takes on greater significance because, in his rhetoric, what I foretold has now happened, and I will campaign on that basis.
I want to bring in Ed O'Keefe, who is at the White House and has traveled recently with President Biden out on the campaign trail. What are you hearing from Biden's advisors?
Nora, we've just gotten off the phone with White House and campaign officials who tell us we will not see or hear from the president for the remainder of today. He remains at his home in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware, with his family, privately marking the death of his son, Beau. Campaign aides stress that the reaction to this, whatever it looks like in the coming days, is expected to be modest because it is their view, based on polling done by us, by other news organizations, by the campaign, that this is not going to move large blocks of voters in battleground states in any real measurable way, that opinions on the former president are pretty much baked in. And to that point, we saw just minutes after this verdict, the former president send an appeal to his supporters to donate to his campaign, calling him a, quote, political prisoner. We saw the current president use his Twitter or X account to blast out a fundraising appeal to his supporters, saying this will all be determined in November. And so both of these campaigns now are preparing for just that. In the case of the Biden campaign, he was in Philadelphia yesterday speaking about the economy, trying to sustain support with black voters, and aides that I was just speaking with remind us the plan is to keep focused on issues like access to abortion rights, corporate greed. You're going into the month of June, so you're dealing with a lot of anniversaries around mass shootings, and that's expected to be part of his focus. And on the world stage, he'll be in France and Italy in the next 2 weeks, meeting with European leaders. There's news this afternoon from here regarding the expansion of the military operations in Ukraine. Just be presidential and allow that contrast to stand alongside what we're seeing on the streets of New York and continue to play out. We now are being handed a statement from the White House counsel's office, and this will stand, Nora, as the only official comment from the White House today. Spokesman for the White House counsel's office saying, quote, "We respect the rule of law and have no additional comment." Nora?
Ed O'Keefe, thank you very much. I want to bring back in Cy Vance as we watch the president's motorcade leave the courthouse there. And Cy, thank you again for staying with us, and it's great to have your expertise as the former Manhattan District Attorney. So Trump would likely have to visit this probation office. Is that now? What is that like?
Well, he, like every other defendant, is going to be interviewed by the probation department because the probation department makes a recommendation to the judge regarding sentence as a state organizational matter. I don't know whether that he was checking that box out while he was still in court. More likely, he was staying there because of the security issues that they wanted to have locked down between courthouse and his Trump residence.
Yeah, and Cy, Major Garrett has a question for you.
Cy, so good to have you with us.
Yeah,
could you, from your perspective, answer or inform parts of the country that hear former President Trump say this case never should have been brought, there is no crime, it is so novel as to stretch all understood bounds of prosecution, even in Manhattan? Those are, I think, the core accusations meant to undermine what we're seeing playing out today. Can you address those?
Well, first of all, you've got to go through a process before you charge anyone, let alone the president, of presenting a case to a grand jury. Those grand jury minutes are reviewed by a judge. The judge goes through innumerable layers of motions to dismiss. I reject the claim that Judge Rochon is biased. Obviously, the former president would disagree with that, but I think he is a very middle-of-the-road, smart, disciplined jurist, and I think he deserves huge credit for managing a very, very difficult case and a particularly very difficult client. So it's easy to blame New York. It's easy to blame the Manhattan DA's office. We were the first office to indict his alter ego company and pursue investigations against him. But that's because it's because of what he did, not because of politics.
Cy, let me ask you, you know Judge Merchan, certainly within the legal system. Do you think he will sentence Donald Trump to prison?
I doubt it. I doubt it. And but giving Judge Merchan wide room to not, not telling him anything about what to do. I think that if this were an more ordinary case, given that Alan Weisselberg was sent to 3 months in prison and then another 3 months for lying, that his boss, Donald Trump, in any other world would probably be getting an equivalent sentence. A sentence of jail is not required for an e-felony, which is what he's been convicted of now. And your other panelists have said there are lots of options, from home arrest to checking in with the probation before leaving the state. There are lots of ways that they can try to control the president's behavior.
Yeah, I mean, I heard what you said, Cy, that you doubt that Judge Merchan would sentence Donald Trump to prison time. But if he did sentence him to prison time, do you think he would grant bond on his appeal while he makes the appeal?
I honestly don't see a world in which Donald Trump is sentenced to jail.
Yeah, I think that's an important clarification. Yeah, an important, and I appreciate that, Cy Vance. I want to just bring in Katrina Kaufman. She is also there outside the courthouse. And Katrina, I know you were inside. You saw Donald Trump up close. Share with us your reporting.
I was sitting right there as Donald Trump exited the courtroom after this verdict, a very deep frown on his face, followed by his attorney, Todd Blanche, who looked equally upset, and his son, Eric. And as the jury had come into the room before to deliver the verdict, Trump was looking towards them, and none of them looked him in the eye as they walked by. And also, when each one was confirming that they agreed with this verdict that the foreman had read, he looked over at each juror one by one as they affirmed the verdict. His son Eric was sitting behind him that whole time, and when they got up, he and Eric had a little bit of a handshake before they exited the room. But I can't describe to you the feeling of tension as well as we waited for the verdict to come down. We got about a 20-minute warning from when the jury sent a note to the judge, and we found out. We were all just sitting there, and you really could have just cut through that tension with a knife. But clearly this was a very difficult moment for him. I was watching him as well as the verdict came down, and he just had this very blank look on his face. His eyes were so squinted that it was almost hard to tell if they were even open during part of the time that the foreman was reading that he was guilty on each of these 34 charges.
Katrina, thank you. And just to recap what we have learned in the last hour, this historic decision, Donald Trump found guilty on all 34 counts. This is the first time in history that this has happened with a former president. He is also the Republican nominee for president and will be sentenced 4 days before the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee this July, and just after a presidential debate as well, the first this summer against Joe Biden, which will be must-see TV, no less. I want to ask about that because I think many people look at, sometimes I just want to step back for a second. When we show national polls, or you read about national polls about the mood of the country, those are the mood of the national electorate. But a presidential race is decided in battleground states. Sure. And it will be decided in 7 key battleground states, just like it was in the last election. And of those 7 battleground states, that's what we'll be looking at closely too, is Does this sway that small percentage or two of voters either way? Does it bring some of Trump's supporters who've been on the fence and say, you know what, this was rigged. I'm really angry. I want to change the country. And they decide to come back. Or do some of those independents in these key 7 battleground states say, you know what, I kind of liked Trump. I like some of the things he did on the economy or on immigration, but this just can't go on. I will cast my vote for Joe Biden, or I'll stay home. I mean, that's the question that confronts us now in terms of the political arena, correct?
Exactly. And there's polling data in, let's just say, 3 of those battleground states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, that show anywhere from 10 to 15% believe if there's a guilty verdict, it might influence how they approach their vote. Well, that's not a sizable total in the 100% context, but in states like Wisconsin, decided by 20,000, Michigan decided by 180,000, Pennsylvania decided in 2020 by 80,000. Suddenly that number, that percentage of people whose votes actually they thought beforehand could be influenced and possibly negatively about Trump if he's found guilty. Well, suddenly that becomes very, very important for the former president and for President Biden. But I would say this about that polling data. It's instructive, Nora, but it is not reliable, because until this moment happens, until this history lands before all of us, we don't know what our attitude is going to be. Now we're beginning that process.
I'm interested what happens to the polls after this remarkable 3 or 4 weeks we're about to experience in America, where there's a presidential debate between 2 men who've had the job before, a president of the United States now out of office being sentenced for a felony, and then a Republican National Convention. And somewhere in between, we also could find out what the Supreme Court is going to let happen here in Washington on the 2020 election conspiracy case.
And whether that trial will go forward.
Whether it even goes forward. All of that happening in this finite period of time.
And Jan, you cover the court so closely. What do you think happens with the Supreme Court? That they will say that he's not completely immune from prosecution?
Because Donald Trump is saying he's absolutely immune from prosecution in the January 6th stuff. They're not going to go along with that. But the appeals court kind of said, well, no, Donald Trump, you can be prosecuted for pretty much anything. I think they're going to find some middle ground where there's some immunity. What is it? And what does that mean? That means that we're going to get a decision potentially at the end of June. Is the court going to send it back to a lower court? And then is that going to further delay this trial?
But practically speaking, what does that mean? So if there is some limited immunity, that would be things that he did while he was president of the United States. So would that cover then these classified documents or January 6th? Those trials could then go forward?
Yes, potentially, absolutely. I do not see the Supreme Court in this case shutting off those federal trials. They may limit some of the charges, but they're not going to say Donald Trump cannot be prosecuted in federal court. But
that will again convulse the nation, don't you think?
No, I don't. I think, yes, it'll be a big headline and it's going to be a big story, but this is the earthquake. This is the trial. This is the conviction that Donald Trump's opponents wanted and they got. There's going to be tremendous validation. Many people believe the system worked as it intended. I think the big headline that we just heard a few moments ago, though, was from Alvin Bragg's predecessor. When you asked him, is Donald Trump going to jail? I mean, he's facing multiple years in prison as a result of this conviction. And he said he can't see a scenario that he would go to jail for this. So now we have a situation where he's been convicted of falsifying business records with intent to cover up a crime that voters really wouldn't have cared about in 2016. And are people actually going to care? And is that going to affect those polls?
Well, it's an excellent question. And fortunately, we have Nicole Killian, who is out on the campaign trail. She's in the battleground state of Pennsylvania. She's been talking to voters. And Nicole, I'm dying to know what you've been learning as you have been out there speaking with people.
Yeah, well, Nora, unsurprisingly, some of the reaction has largely fallen on party lines. As you mentioned, this is a critical battleground state, but this area of Allentown in the Lehigh Valley is really a bellwether for the state of Pennsylvania. So we did talk to some Democratic voters, some Republican voters. Of course, many Democrats tell us that they believe the former president should have been convicted, but many Republican voters that we talked to feel that the system is broken, that this was just a political trial and a political decision. That being said, one Republican voter I spoke to in particular is still wavering to a certain extent in terms of his vote. This is somebody who supported the former president back in 2016 and 2020, but is not sure whether he will support the former president going forward. Nora?
That is really interesting, Nicole. Thank you so much for your reporting there. It has been a historic day here in America. The first ever criminal trial of a president ends in conviction. Former President Donald J. Trump convicted on 34 felony counts of falsifying business records in the first degree related to those hush money payments. Each of the 34 felony counts is punishable by up to 4 years in prison. But it is up to the judge to sentence Trump to jail, prison, home confinement, probation, or a fine. And we will learn the former president's sentence on July 11th. That is just 4 days before the Republican National Convention. The former president is a convicted felon, but that does not prevent him from running for office for another term in the White House. And it is important also to note that he can't pardon himself if he does become president again, because this is a state crime. Once again, the breaking news: former President Donald Trump has been found guilty by a jury of 12, unanimous, on all 34 counts of falsifying business records. Our coverage will continue on CBS News 24/7 local news, and tonight we'll have a full wrap-up on the CBS Evening News. Thank you to everyone that joined us. This has been a CBS News special report.
Hello, thank you for joining us. For the first time in the 237-year history of the American presidency, one of the 46 men who has served in that office is a convicted felon. After 2 days of deliberations, the jury in Donald Trump's criminal trial in New York City has unanimously found the former president and current likely Republican nominee guilty on all 34 counts of falsifying business records. Mr. Trump spoke outside the courthouse following the verdict.
This was a disgrace. This was a rigged trial by a conflicted judge who was corrupt. It's a rigged trial, a disgrace. They wouldn't give us a venue change. We were at 5% or 6% in this district, in this area. This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. But the real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people. And they know what happened here, and everybody knows what happened here.
Before we begin breaking down the verdict, we want to remind viewers how we got here in the first place. Prosecutors allege, and the jury believed, that the former president, his then attorney Michael Cohen, and National Enquirer publisher David Pecker met at Trump Tower in 2015. They claim the three discussed how to conceal negative stories about Trump in order to get him elected. In October 2016, Cohen and an attorney for adult film actress Stormy Daniels negotiated a $130,000 deal to keep her quiet about an alleged sexual encounter with Trump in 2006. Trump, the jury believed, reimbursed Cohen for the payment, claiming it was for legal fees. That was the criminal issue at the center of this case. For more, let's bring in Errol Barnett and Katrina Kaufman outside the courthouse in Lower Manhattan. Errol is CBS News national correspondent, and Katrina is a CBS News campaign reporter and attorney. Katrina, you've been in the courtroom throughout this trial. Tell us what it was like when the verdict was read.
So I was sitting in the courtroom on the end of one of the rows when the verdict was read, watching the jury, watching Trump. He was just looking straight ahead, very stone-faced. His eyes were so squinted, I honestly couldn't even tell if they were open for some of the time. But the foreman read that he was guilty on all counts, and then the judge goes and confirms with each juror that they concur with that verdict. And so Trump looked at those jurors one by one as they affirmed that they were finding him guilty on all 34 counts in this case. And then when it came to leave the room, Trump got up, turned around, and he and his son, Eric, who'd been sitting slightly behind him, had a quick handshake. Eric had also just been sitting there looking at the jury, looking ahead at his father. And when he walked out of the room, he passed right by me with, I think, the deepest frown that I've ever seen on his face, followed by his attorney, Todd Blanche, who just looked equally morose, and his son and the rest of his team trailing behind him.
Katrina, was there any audible response from either the peanut gallery or the prosecutors or anybody?
I didn't hear any audible response. He just really, honestly sat there just looking so morose, looking straight ahead, almost as though he was trying to block out what was going on, but also hearing it at the same time. But there was very little reaction that I could see. I did see Eric. I was watching him as the charges were being read, and the foreman was saying that he was guilty on the counts. He started shaking his head no slightly as he was looking ahead at his dad.
Errol, this is the first conviction of an American president, a president who has created extraordinary swirl everywhere he goes, and who has some durable and diehard supporters. So with that kind of setup, what was the mood like outside? This also is taking place in a city where people like to go about their business even when extraordinary things are happening all right around them.
Yeah, John, that's certainly evident now. What's interesting is when it was clear that there was a verdict, there was a sense, a palpable sense out here of some type of excitement. You have pro-Trump supporters who've been showing up outside the courthouse for many weeks, and also anti-Trump protesters. What we witnessed after we reported that Trump was guilty on all 34 felony counts is that you had a few dozen pro and anti-Trump protesters here in the streets behind us, as well as a healthy mix of just regular New Yorkers who some were gathering to head towards Trump's motorcade before it left the courthouse. So after the verdict was read, after Trump passed Katrina, Trump was inside the courthouse for a good 30 minutes and then was seen assembling on his motorcade before departing the courthouse. And he was welcomed both by pro-Trump supporters who had lined the streets and anti-Trump demonstrators. Some of those anti-Trump demonstrators you might hear behind us who were chanting on each count, guilty and guilty. And we should also note that one aspect that added to the mood both inside and outside the courthouse was just how relatively quickly these 12 jurors decided unanimously that Donald Trump was guilty. Yesterday, it was only roughly 4 hours of deliberation before they sent back a note requesting more guidance from Judge Merchan and more testimony, specifically from David Pecker. This morning started with them getting that guidance from the judge, getting testimony from David Pecker read back to them. And that's significant because Cohen, of course, had credibility issues. The judge had said you should consider him an accomplice, and so you can't convict based on his testimony alone unless it is corroborated by other testimony and other evidence. And that's precisely what the jurors wanted to go back and examine after they got the additional testimony read to them this morning. So they seem to hone in on the Trump Tower meeting of 2015, the nexus of the scheme, and everything David Pecker said about it that lined up with Cohen's testimony before they returned this unanimous verdict. So relatively a fast decision by this 12-person jury who was made now, an historic decision.
And Katrina, we should note we have not, as far as I'm aware, heard anything from the jury, reminding that at least one person who was in the jury was concerned and left before this all started because of safety concerns. So we don't know whether we'll hear from the jury, though the judge, as I understand, has said they can talk. Katrina, you watched this whole thing. Were you surprised by the speed, by the outcome? Just what struck you in terms of the argument that Errol was making there? And it sounds like the police are doing a little crowd control behind you. What surprised you about this, Katrina?
I mean, I was absolutely surprised by the speed. I guess to set the scene a little bit more for you, we actually had thought that we were done for the day. The judge brought us all into the courtroom, had said that he was going to release the jury at 4:30, and he was just going to step out for a few minutes. And so we were all waiting, thinking that there was going to be a whole other day of deliberation. But when the judge returned, he said he had gotten a note from the jury. They had their verdict, and they just wanted 30 more minutes to fill out the verdict sheet. So I honestly thought that we were probably going to have another day on this, but this jury has clearly taken the case very seriously. They are always extremely attentive. They are taking lots of notes. This was actually to an alternate, but the judge noted that he saw one of them go through 3 different notebooks during this trial. And to what Errol was saying earlier, they wanted a number of pieces of testimony read back, and they also wanted to hear a part of the jury instruction. It was a significant amount of pages, but they referenced one part specifically, and it was about inference, and they wanted to hear about something related to rain that the judge had written, and it essentially said that, you know, if you wake up in the morning and you see that it's wet outside and you see umbrellas, you can deduce that it rained during the night, and that was something they could apply in this case, that if all of the facts surrounding something led to a certain conclusion, that you could deduce that conclusion if it seemed rational and reasonable. And I think given the many pieces that the jury had to tie together in this case, that was very significant that they wanted to hone in on that detail.
And just quickly on that point, Katrina, that is a legal principle that exists in the law. In other words, you're allowed to use your own reason. You don't need to have videotaped evidence of the crime as alleged. If your reason and the facts leads you to a conclusion, that's not some crazy new route in the law. That's something one would be taught in law school.
Absolutely not. Yes, that is inference. It's just, I think the way that he described it was very palpable for them to understand. And obviously the jury instructions are all about telling them how to apply the law to the facts of this very complicated case. It was a very layered legal charge that they had to comprehend and wrap their minds around. But I think being in that room, the prosecution put on an extremely strong case. And we've talked about it before, but watching the progression of the witnesses and the way it came together was honestly almost like watching a puzzle come together very tightly by the end. And I think they did a really good job of weaving together this narrative, of finding so much documentation, all of the text messages, the emails, the audio recordings. That was another actually interesting part of this morning, is the jury requested headphones, and they ended up either giving them both speakers and headphones, and there were some audio materials in this. One of them was the secret recording that Michael Cohen had made of Donald Trump when they seemed to be talking about the Karen McDougal deal. And we don't know exactly why they wanted it, but it did strike me that when Joshua Steinglass for the prosecution gave his closing argument, there was some debate over whether you could actually hear Trump say the word 150 on the tape. And what 150 means is that's the amount that Karen McDougal was paid for her story. And the prosecution said it indicated that he had knowledge of the fact that they were paying her, of the amount. And he said to the jury, you can get this recording. You can have it in the jury room. I encourage you to play it as loud as you want, as many times as you want, and I promise you that you will hear 150 if you do that. And so when they asked for speakers and headphones, I wondered if that might be what they were doing in there.
Right. That's the September 2016 taped meeting about McDougal, which is not Stormy Daniels, but creates this evidence pattern that the former president was quite concerned about this set of issues and set him on the path to what ultimately happened with Daniels. Errol, let me ask you this question. Safety, I mentioned it before. What's the posture around there right now? And what concerns do officials have about either the safety with respect to the jurors or just in response to this verdict?
Well, it was evident that the NYPD, which is used to, conducting high-profile cases and allowing a busy place like New York to keep operating while protecting everyone who is involved, including the media, it was noteworthy that for today and yesterday, they actually cleared the street behind us, which on the right, you'll see the courthouse. On the left is where the media, most of the media is assembled. They cleared it of all parked vehicles for today and yesterday, whereas for the past 6 weeks, people could park their cars as they wish. They wouldn't allow people along the street behind us to stop walking. You could walk if you had business in the court or if you needed to get somewhere, but onlookers who would stop and take pictures and take video and just watch would be ushered along. Let's not forget that just a few weeks ago, the public park directly across from the courthouse had an incident where a man set himself on fire and he ended up passing away that following weekend, but the park had remained open to the public as an example of the NYPD's efforts to allow the city to operate as possible and to have the smallest footprint as possible. But also, as I think we mentioned, this group behind us, which has been growing in the past hour or so, some of them did rush down to where Trump's motorcade was about to exit. Then we saw about half a dozen NYPD trucks and SUVs line the street as well as kind of a show of force. So the NYPD, it would seem, has kind of successfully allowed this trial to take place. Plenty of other trials and proceedings are taking place at the same time, despite the fact that we've had a former president with full Secret Service protection in and out of this building each day these past 6 weeks or so.
History takes place and the people walk on. Errol Barnett and Katrina Kaufman outside the courthouse for us. Thank you very much. CBS News Chief Washington Correspondent Major Garrett joins us now from D.C. Major, I believe you and I were talking. I believe you were down in Mar-a-Lago. It's hard to keep up with all of the indictments, but after the former president was indicted in this case, he made a bit of a meal of it, as I recall.
Yes.
Take that moment in time and to where we are today right now, and give me your impressions, having covered this man for so long.
So at Mar-a-Lago, we spoke because the former president was throwing the first of its kind, an indictment party, essentially, rallying those around him to what he said at the time was an unjust process that was out to get him, and that he was beginning the process of identifying himself as a victim of the legal system. And many in the audience at Mar-a-Lago, quite predictably, were supportive of that. That was one moment. I also remember, John, because I covered the presidential campaign of Donald Trump extensively for about 16 months. And I remembered when he was a candidate, then when he was president, and stories or questions about this kind of conduct arose, whether it was any previous affair or was there ever an attempt to bury that information. All questions about that were met with hostile, forceful, aggressive denials. Those denials evaporated in the courthouse proceedings of the last 5.5 to 6 weeks. It had been proven, established, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that there was a process by which stories favorable were placed, unfavorable caught and killed. Well, now, whether the country believes that is a crime sufficient enough to render the former president now a convicted felon who faces prison time is a separate matter. My only point, John, is that the former president at Mar-a-Lago, when this conversation you and I are having just began this evening, was about how the system was unjust and all these things alleged were untrue and false. Many of those allegations have now been proven to be true, and those aggressive denials did not withstand evidentiary scrutiny. And one of the things the country is going to begin to debate from this day forward, from this moment forward, John, is the absolute value of the terminology rigged. Because the former president says in every instance, every single instance, whether it's a civil case, whether it's about whether or not he sexually assaulted a woman in New York, or his business records in this case were fraudulent or not. Every single case, January 6th, Fulton County, classified documents. In every instance, the entire system is arrayed against him and him alone.
Yes.
Well, now a jury of his peers has said, you know what, it's not arrayed against you. It's your conduct that brought all this into being in the first place. And there's a law that asks us whether or not that conduct is felonious or not. And 12 jurors said unanimously 34 times, it is.
We just saw pictures there of the former president in front of Trump Tower, a building that is thoroughly associated with this city, as the former president has been for his entire life. Let me ask you this, Major, as the final question. Okay, there's a campaign going on, but give me your sense of some of the effects that will happen from this. I mean, everything from there are people applying and auditioning to be his vice president. How will they react to this? And what incentives might they have to now talk about the jury system and what's rigged and what isn't rigged? How do you think this will ripple through the election?
In Republican precincts across this country, John, this will echo as what the former president describes it as. Something that should never have been brought, that is a miscarriage of justice, or to use the terminology of the sitting chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, a travesty or a shameful day in America, as the Speaker of the House of Representatives said in a statement this afternoon. That will resonate among Republicans. Many Democrats and maybe some independents might say to themselves, the system now is applying accountability. And if there's been anything constant from their vantage point about former President Trump, is his ability to dodge accountability and essentially say to the systems of our country, what are you going to do about it? And doing so with a kind of impunity that drove Democrats, certainly, and maybe some independents, to the point of distraction, if not worse. There will be partisan alignment, as there is almost everything in our political life in this country right now, John. But there will be some fair-minded Americans who are not hard partisans, right or left, who will now scrutinize this because the system has rendered a judgment. Until this afternoon, that judgment was a pure abstraction. It is abstract no longer.
Major Garrett from Washington. Thank you so much, Major. CBS News legal contributor and Loyola Law School professor Jessica Levinson joins me now. Jessica, let's now sit right down on top of the law here. We've been talking about politics and the reaction in the street. What successful case did the prosecution make here, just to remind people of what they were able to do, and your reaction to the case now that there's been a verdict?
Well, my reaction is that the prosecution was able to tell a consistent story of what makes the most sense here. What makes the most sense is that Donald Trump entered into basically a criminal conspiracy to try and bury this story, and that's Stormy Daniels' allegations in the wake of the Access Hollywood tape, so that the voters didn't hear about what she has to say. And you, the jury, heard what she had to say. How do you think that would have landed with the voters right before they walked into the ballot box? So I think the prosecution was able to take a complicated case. John, you and I talked about it. There were a lot of hurdles that the prosecution had to cross, and they were able to say, what makes the most sense? And I think what's important is they really did use, forgive the expression, but a belt and suspenders approach, where they knew that they didn't have perfect witnesses. They knew that they didn't always have perfect evidence, but every moment they tried to say, we're backing it up. You don't just have to believe Michael Cohen. Look at what everybody else is telling you as well. You know, I have to say, when we got word that the verdict was coming back today at this moment, I think it was clear what the verdict was. But let's remember, there are still live issues on appeal.
Well, that's a crucial point to make. While we're talking here about respecting the judicial process, there is the jury part of the process, and then there is the appeals part of the process. So before we get to punishment, clearly they're already thinking about appeals in the Trump camp. What would be a reasonable ground, or what do you think the appeals process will look like from them?
So I think it will be everything from start to finish, in the sense that there are some questions about whether or not some of the jurors potentially should have been kicked for cause, meaning that they just shouldn't have been there because they couldn't render a fair verdict. There will be questions about the way this case was charged. This is a state case dealing with a federal candidate, and it was a fairly novel application of a New York election law, which said the falsification of business records, that alone is a misdemeanor. How do you kick it up to a felony? You have intent to commit or conceal another crime. That other crime, as I just mentioned, was basically unlawful election interference in New York. And then they had to add meaning to that word unlawful. The judge gave them three options: campaign finance violations, federal campaign finance violations, state and federal tax violations, and other business records violations. That is unique. Watch for the Trump team to say the way this was charged is not proper. It violated due process, and the statutes did not allow for a conviction under this circumstance. I think lastly, look for them to challenge not just the judge in this case, but to challenge Stormy Daniels' testimony, where they asked for a mistrial right after the testimony. They said it was irrelevant. It went too far. So lots of live grounds for them to appeal here.
Right. Irrelevant, went too far into the details of the alleged encounter. Let's go now back to the punishment. Sentencing is scheduled for the 11th of July. What can we expect to happen there? And give us your sense of whether, everybody wants to know about whether jail time is even in the possibility here.
It's a possibility, but I do not think it's a probability. Let's look at what's going on. First-time offender, non-violent felonies. If we are to say that this is a case where we're treating the former president like any other defendant, I think, John, if you and I were having this conversation about Donald Smith, I would say, looking at all the allegations here, we're looking at probation. Now, that's not nothing, but it's certainly not time in prison. And I know that separate from that, a lot of people are saying he's a convicted felon. Can he vote? And my best reading of the law is, as a voter in New York, you look to the law where he's convicted. New York says you can vote unless he's incarcerated. So no incarceration means he can vote.
Unless he has to vote in Florida, which has, I think, a different set of laws, right? It's determined by the state that he would be in. So because I think he's going to be voting in Florida.
So I believe that, I apologize. I believe Florida says look to the law of the state where you were convicted.
Oh, okay. Okay, it's very helpful. Now, let me ask you about the Supreme Court, where, I mean, could they have a role in this ladder of appeals, or, well, just take it from there?
Yes, but this is a state case. And so they have to find, for the Supreme Court to take it up, they have to find a live federal question. And so there could be, I think the defense will try and say, well, there are due process considerations here with, again, how the case proceeded, how it was charged. But I do want to emphasize that the vast, vast majority of times, the state Supreme Court is the last word on a state criminal conviction. Again, I think that doesn't mean the Trump team won't try and bring this to the Supreme Court. But John, as you know, the Supreme Court is plenty busy with some other Trump cases as well, dealing with his immunity from criminal prosecution for official acts and dealing with whether or not that obstruction statute that he is charged under in the DC election interference case is a good fit for January 6th.
Let me ask you a question, Jessica, about the judge's instructions. One of the things that the jury asked for was a portion of that to be reread for them. Did you see anything out of the ordinary in the judge's instructions? Because that's one of the things, I mean, there were many things mentioned, some of them not germane by the former president, but the role of the judge in this, did you see anything in his jury instructions? Because some other Republicans, Senator Marco Rubio, have mentioned something about the jury instructions. Did you see anything in that was either grounds for appeal or that was not according to the normal patterns that judges use in these cases?
So I guess I would say two things. One, with respect to questioning the judge, we know this is a judge who has made very small donations to Democratic candidates and campaigns. Expect to hear about that a lot more in the wake of this particular conviction. Now, a New York body overseeing this issue, these ethics issues, said, Judge Merchan, you can go ahead and you can hear this case. Separately, you asked me about the jury instructions, and the one that stands out to me is the idea that, and again, forgive me for the multi-step process, falsification of business records, intent to commit or conceal another crime. The other crime is unlawful election interference. I'm paraphrasing. But what the judge said is when you fill in the meaning of that word unlawful, it could be one of three crimes, and you don't all have to. My understanding is you don't all have to agree on which one, as long as you all agree there was unlawful intent to commit an unlawful activity here. And so that is just not, as I understand it, a typical scheme. It doesn't mean that it's not legal. It means that I think we're going to be hearing more about that as the jury instruction where there might be some question.
Jessica Levinson, tremendously helpful as always. Thank you, Jessica. We are awaiting a news conference from District Attorney Alvin Bragg following the guilty verdict. He's expected to deliver remarks in, well, any moment, really, and we'll be taking those live. Still ahead, how the verdict could affect the rest of Trump's campaign. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back, of course. You're streaming The Daily Report.
Coming up, our series. Wait a minute. Tom, is that you working the camera?
Keep leaning out of your close-up.
Your morning routine just got better. CBS Mornings, weekdays at 7.
I had progressively fallen deeper into the world of online sports betting.
The risk is the rush.
What do you think is driving the spike in popularity?
I think it's legality.
If it's legal, I'm going to use it. There are ways to bet when you are 18.
We've created an epidemic of child gambling.
You can't walk into a male dormitory in a college campus without sports betting happening.
It's America's most neglected problem.
I used sports betting as a way to escape, when in reality, I'm choosing self-destruction. Whatever I had left, it was gone.
The purpose of the industry is to get you to play to extinction. And that means until all your money is gone.
Go to the ends of the earth. Reach for the stars.
Yeah, I just took off. That kind of thing.
Oh, that's pretty good. Because there's always something new under the sun on CBS Sunday morning.
An original documentary from CBS Reports.
That desired farm, it's a wonderful place to raise children, and it still is.
Promises broken.
Black Americans have been the target of racism and discrimination pretty much from the time they acquired ownership in the land.
Costing black farmers hundreds of billions in generational wealth.
They did everything to make sure we were run off that land.
But communities are uniting to continue the fight.
Collective ownership is powerful.
To keep their land and their dreams alive.
To watch my children play on land that we own means everything.
So land is power.
Most definitely.
40 Acres and a Mule, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
People with developmental disabilities were once sequestered by the hundreds of thousands in institutions.
Many of our fellow citizens are suffering tremendously because lack of attention, lack of imagination, lack of adequate manpower.
Disability activists have since torn down barriers blocking them from living at home or in the community.
We conclude that Title II of the ADA requires states to provide community-based treatment for persons with mental disabilities.
But of the 16,000 people who remain in state-operated institutions, half are in 5 states, and Illinois is one of them.
I don't want to live in the institution. It makes me feel discriminated against.
Do you think there are people living in institutions in Illinois that don't need to be living there?
Yeah, because they're proving it as soon as they get out.
For the first time in American history, a former president is a convicted criminal. A New York jury found Donald Trump guilty on all 34 counts of falsifying business records in his landmark hush money trial. CBS News political director Fin Gomez joins us with more. Fin, first of all, something like this happens, campaigns, rush to their text out or get you on the phone. What have you started hearing from the Trump camp?
Well, the Trump campaign plans, essentially what we heard the president say today is what they expect him to say. We're not expecting any other events today. He's not rushing back to Mar-a-Lago, I'm being told. But I've asked if this will have a political impact on what they believe is the trajectory back to the White House. They feel that if anything, it helps the base. It pushes the base out there. The base is livid. They're fired up. They're falling into the narrative that we've heard Trump saying in and day out at 100 Center Street, that this is a witch hunt, that this is this is a political. There's been a political calculus underlying this whole operation. They feel it falls to that narrative. However, talking to the Biden folks or people close to the Biden campaign, they tell me that essentially their sense, their perspective is to essentially stay out of it, not get into the mire, right?
Right. So, yeah, you don't want to get in the way of your opponent when your opponent's having troubles.
Exactly.
But going back to the Trump campaign, man cannot live by base alone, one might say, which is to say the base will no doubt see this as further persecution of a man they see as endlessly hounded by everyone, the media included. But what about the voters with whom Trump has trouble within even his own base, which is anybody who's not in the kind of Make America Great Again hardcore? What about those voters who would have been otherwise traditionally Republican voters?
Well, we have seen some polling that's come out in recent days. There's one out even today. There was a NewsHour Marist poll that said essentially that voters or likely voters would not be impacted. It really would have moved the dial one way or the other. For the most part, we're looking at those 7 battleground states, as you know, John, and the polling that we have seen shows that it's really not a top issue. But about those specific voters that you're referring to, and I would say, like, there's been a lot said about the Haley supporters, if you will, the sort of formerly McCain Republicans who are like traditional conservatives or even moderate, and to them, speaking to top Democrats earlier today, those associated with the Biden campaign, they do feel that this helps their cause. They do feel that those who are on the bubble in those respective 7 states, especially, could have their decision impacted by this. Like, they're not expecting this. They're not expecting any sort of like fantasies here, or any sort of like a huge dial move, if you will. But will it have an impact? They feel yes. Will it have an impact with those persuadable Republican voters somewhere in the middle? They believe they do have a stronger argument now that this has happened. However, John, as you know, probably better than anybody, we have 5 months left until the November 5th election. right? The best thing for Trump politically is that there are 5 months left. The worst thing for Trump politically is that there are 5 months left, because that could be a
What do you think this does? Conventions ain't what they used to be, of course, but the sentencing is 5 days before the Republican convention. What do you think this does to that?
Just a few days before the convention, right? Just a few days before we were expected, or around the time, because they themselves said that we could hear who the vice presidential running mate will be around the convention, and just before the first debate that is happening. We've never been here before, John. This is such an unprecedented place that we've been to, where I know we talked about it like ad nauseum now, but we've never seen this in American history. We've now never seen a convicted presumptive nominee of a major party who is leading in many polls that we've seen.
In the Democratic Party, if this happened, there would be endless rounds of hand-wringing. I mean, there's lots of hand-wringing going on in the Democratic Party right now without a criminal conviction. That's more their way of doing things. Do you expect anything like that on the Republican side? There is, of course, the anti-Trump. We can name the members of the anti-Trump wing. Many of them are former or are on their way out the door because the party no longer is interested in them. But do you see this, I mean, being a convicted criminal, despite what the former president is saying, having any new germination inside the Republican Party for any leader or any member of the House or Senate who might think, well, maybe I'm going to, react to this other than purely being on the president's side?
I think potentially, yes. To some degree, again, going back, not the base voter, not even some of these elected officials who are currently running. And as you know, there's a lot more territory now on the Senate side, if you will, Republicans running and trying to capture more seats in the Senate. Will this have an effect? Will this influence that voter? I think we have to wait to see how what this does. We did know, John, that just a few days ago, I did speak to some top Democrats who are close to the Biden campaign who were nervous, apprehensive about Trump's standing in recent polls, apprehensive about the direction of the campaign. What this does also is that we're not focused fully on this.
Yeah.
We're focused fully on this conviction, right? So, that kind of goes to the side. And now that's going to get so much attention, their hope is that there will be more focus by these voters who may not be paying attention, who may be just kind of paying attention peripherally.
It's a very good point. The low information voter, this is now on the screens of every TV and will be in the maybe breakthrough. That's really interesting. Finn Gomez, thank you so much.
Thanks,
CBS
Sean.
News political director. Daniel Horowitz joins me now. He's a partner at McLaughlin and Stern law firm, and he's a former Manhattan assistant district attorney. Thank you so much for being with us, Daniel. As a former assistant DA in the Manhattan district attorney's office, what do you make of the verdict?
I'm not surprised. The DA put together a masterful case with tremendous amount of corroboration around Michael Cohen. They had witnesses to the hilt. They had tapes. They had documents. They did an extraordinarily thorough and comprehensive job. And the fact that the jury came back so quickly with a verdict, and frankly, the questions that they posed yesterday really sort of framed exactly what the DA wanted them to think about, which is the bookend of David Pecker and Michael Cohen corroborating each other about the most important elements of the crime.
So explain that bookend for people who are not fully versed on all the details of this case. What were the two underlying, or what were the most important underlying facts that were solidified? And just to remind people, Michael Cohen was a thoroughly compromised witness who spent his career lying as an employee for Donald Trump, was then convicted for lying, and then wasn't, didn't seem tremendously credible at times on the stand. Nevertheless, your point is there was corroborating evidence around those bookends. Explain what you think that they solidified in the minds of the jury.
Sure. I mean, the central allegation is that Donald Trump, along with Michael Cohen and David Pecker, orchestrated this conspiracy to help Trump get elected by suppressing unfavorable and unflattering stories, and by paying off Stormy Daniels, not to tell her story that Donald Trump had slept with her, Karen McDougal, the same thing. And David Pecker, as the publisher of the National Enquirer, was a critical player in that because there were stories from Stormy Daniels, from Karen McDougal, that, to use his word, the National Enquirer caught and killed, meaning that they went out, got the stories, paid those people money so that the stories would never run. And that was all intended to help Donald Trump in the days leading up to the 2016 election. And the bookends, you have David Pecker, longtime publisher of the National Enquirer, friend of Donald Trump, said he was a friend of Donald Trump when he testified, said he still liked Donald Trump, testifying. You also have Michael Cohen, the president's fixer, who by title was a lawyer, but really did all the dirty work. And he's the one who sort of put all of the details into execution that Trump had detailed to him, along with Trump's other lieutenants, Ellen Weisselberg and others in the Trump organization.
Daniel, let me ask you this final question about this possible grounds for appeal on this question, which is the judge instructed the jury that as they considered the evidence and considered whether the former president falsified business records, they had to think about whether it was done in furtherance of covering up another crime, and that they could choose between three different kinds of crimes. One were state election laws, one was federal election laws, and then the third was other business forms, I guess also, and tax records. The argument from the Trump team is that's crazy, the kind of pick your lane way of turning this into a felony. Why is that not a good grounds for appeal?
I mean, I think that it's, as a lot of people have said, it's not a theory that's been well trod. And so as a result, any defense lawyer, whether it's Donald Trump's or anybody else, is going to say, hey, look, this is a novel theory, so we've got good grounds for appeal. The reason it doesn't really work, in my view, is because the fundamental crime that underlies the falsifying of business records, in other words, false entries were made in business records to cover up another crime. And that crime, as the judge instructed the jury, was a violation of New York State election law, which says that you can't engage in illegal conduct with an election by unlawful means. And it's that phrase, the unlawful means, that Trump and his team have seized on. And the prosecutors and the judge instructed the jury that there are these three different alternatives as to what unlawful means actually means. Now, I don't think that at the end of the day, the appellate division, which is the appellate court in New York State, is going to find much truck in Trump's argument on that point.
Daniel Horowitz, thank you so much for being with us. CBS News congressional correspondent Scott MacFarlane joins me now from Allentown, Pennsylvania. Scott, what's the read? What are you hearing from congressional leaders, or if not leaders, members of Congress reacting to this guilty verdict of the former president?
Yeah, John, first of all, the dividing line is pretty clear here on the reaction, and it's somewhat predictable. We're hearing the words corrupt, rigged, weaponized, and political in the statements from Republicans and Trump allies about the jury's decision. So many of them ascribing a motive to the Biden administration, despite the fact that that is a meritless claim, and that this was a local, not a federal prosecution brought by a prosecutor in Manhattan, approved by a grand jury of Mr. Trump's peers, and a conviction by a jury of Mr. Trump's peers. The Democrats are leaning into the opposite argument, one that you would expect, that this was a righteous prosecution, that it was a jury's voice and a jury's decision, and that Donald Trump is now not just a former president, but a convicted felon. Doesn't seem to be any surprises in the political reaction. I'll just note a couple small things that are worth mentioning. There was one Republican, Bill Cassidy of Louisiana, criticized the prosecution. He's one of the few senators on the Republican side who voted to convict Donald Trump, impeach him in 2021. He criticized the defense for its strategy in this trial. And Larry Hogan, the Republican trying to win the nomination or to win the general election in the blue state of Maryland, said it's time for Americans to come together and stop being so divided by politics a bit of an equivocation from somebody trying to run as a moderate.
Yes, and as if politics were a free-floating thing, there are some specifics to wrestle with today, but the former governor will have to do that on his own. Let me ask you something, Scott. You've covered a lot of trials. Remind us again what usually happens when somebody is convicted. My recollection from covering a few trials myself is they say, we respect the jury's decision and we will appeal because we think on the law we have a case. But there is some nod made to the process that you still then are going to have to be in as you work your appeal to get the guilty verdict overturned. A, do I have that right or wrong? And B, give me your historical perspective on how convicted members usually respond as a way to gauge the Trump response versus what the norm is.
That's a good question. Let's look at this huge set of cases we have that are Trump adjacent. The January 6th criminal prosecutions, those are in federal court. Sentencing happens through a very rigorous, traditional, months-long process, and we've heard any number of the defendants in those cases, question the political leanings of the jury and the venue. This destabilizing argument that jurors are political creatures who operate as political creatures when they're jurors. That's a destabilizing argument that has led to some appeals, none of which have been successful. In fact, an appeals court just this week, John, shot down a January 6th defendant's argument that he had a loaded jury from Washington, D.C. in his case. You see the same type of destabilizing arguments already popping up in the hours after the Trump conviction, that this was a liberal jury in Manhattan, that we can't trust the jury system. I don't know what the consequences of that are, John, but we saw the consequences of when they destabilized the integrity of American elections in 2020, and we're still feeling the pain of that to this day.
Yeah, it's a very good point. You can think even, I think, that the jury got it wrong. You can maybe even think the judge had wrong instructions. But for lawmakers to make this leap and say, which, as you pointed out, has no merit and no evidence, that this is somehow connected to Biden, that seems to go a step further and engage in the kind of danger you're talking about, which is to sow doubt about the very system. And in our politics, we have seen, because doubt was sowed about the outcome of the 2020 election, that for a certain group of people in the country, when there is doubt, they take matters into their own hands. You've covered the people who took matters into their own hands when they had this gasoline thrown on the floor, when they were told that the system was rigged. How, when they were told the system was rigged, we have, sorry, Scott, with that windup, we now have Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg at the microphones.
Good evening. First and foremost, I want to thank the jury for its service. Jurors perform a fundamental civic duty. Their service is literally the cornerstone of our judicial system. We should all be thankful for the careful attention that this jury paid to the evidence and the law and their time and commitment over these past several weeks. 12 everyday New Yorkers, and of course, our alternates, heard testimony from 22 witnesses, including former and current employees of the defendant, media executives, book publishers, custodians of records, and others. They reviewed call logs, text messages, and emails. They heard recordings. They saw checks and invoices, bank statements, and calendar appointments. This type of white-collar prosecution is core to what we do at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. In the 1930s, District Attorney Thomas Dewey ushered in the era of the modern, independent professional prosecutor. For now nearly 90 years, dedicated professionals in this office have built upon that fine tradition. A major part of our practice during that nearly 90 years has been public integrity work, including cases involving jurists, local and state electeds, public servants, and others. I want to thank this phenomenal prosecution team, embodying the finest traditions of this office: professionalism, integrity, dedication, and service. They are model public servants, and I am proud and humbled to serve side by side with them. The 12 everyday jurors vowed to make a decision based on the evidence and the law, and the evidence and the law alone. Their deliberations led them to a unanimous conclusion beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant, Donald J. Trump, is guilty of 34 counts of falsifying business records in the first degree to conceal a scheme to corrupt the 2016 election. And while this defendant may be unlike any other in American history, we arrived at this trial and ultimately today at this verdict in the same manner as every other case that comes through the courtroom doors, by following the facts and the law and doing so without fear or favor. I want to conclude by expressing deep gratitude to the NYPD and the officers of the Office of Court Administration for securing the courthouse, all of our safety, making sure the courthouse and all of the other matters that are important in their own right continued seamlessly. They will continue to be and have always been incredible partners. Thank you.
And do you plan to request a prison sentence for this conviction? And do you think that Donald Trump's multiple violations of the gag order that was in place should factor into that request at all?
The judge scheduled a sentencing for July 11th. We will speak in court in that time. He also set a motion schedule. We will speak in our court filings as we've done throughout this proceeding.
Donald Trump has repeatedly targeted you personally and members of your prosecution team. Do you have a response to the former president after this trial is concluded?
I do not.
In February, you decided not to bring a case against Donald Trump. You criticized that. You criticized when you embedded him. March 2023. You criticized when people really started to understand that case. How do you think of all that now, seeing the results of that? Can you kind of put that in context with your personal history?
I did my job. Our job is to follow the facts and the law without fear or favor. And that's exactly what we did here. And what I feel is just gratitude to work alongside phenomenal public servants who do that each and every day in matters that you all write about and make the press, and in lots of matters that you don't. I did my job. We did our job. Many voices out there. The only voice that matters is the voice of the jury, and the jury has spoken.
Could I ask Mr. Steinglass, many people said the prosecution was masterful and flawless. Just want to know how you feel at this moment. Sorry. How do you feel?
Mr. Steinglass, I think some of you probably saw him speak for a little bit the other day. So he's done his job, as has this team. And he just told me, tell him how I feel. I think you said that. I will just say just enormous gratitude. You know, our system, I talked about the jurors at the beginning of my remarks. We have a phenomenal system. 12 everyday New Yorkers. They listen to the judge's directions. They follow the evidence. You saw them in court every day. They were careful and attentive. And so I feel deep gratitude to work alongside them, to be a part of this system. And I just want to echo that this is what we're doing every single day. I mean, during this trial, just this week, right, a ghost gun indictment, Grimaldi's wage theft plea resolution, sex crimes, convictions, all sorts of work that's being done by phenomenal public servants. So we're before you today on this obviously consequential matter, but this is what we do every day. We follow the facts and the law without fear or favor.
If a jail sentence is in the cards, it is likely that Trump and his attorneys would seek a stay on enforcement of that sentence pending appeal. If that were the scenario, would your office object to staying the sentence?
I'm going to let our words in court speak for themselves when we get to the sentencing matter. I'm not going to address hypotheticals. They raise arguments, we'll respond, and I think your question really underscores an important point. This is an active, ongoing matter, right? We have other phases of this going ahead. We will continue to do our speaking about this matter, about issues like that in court.
All right, last one.
From day one, kind of the viability of this case has been questioned in all sorts of media outlets, all over the place, including from the defendant himself. Can you respond to any of that, how you feel now that you've gotten the conviction?
So my response, again, is I did my job.
You've been listening to Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg discuss the guilty verdict in Donald Trump's criminal trial. CBS News congressional correspondent Scott McFarland joins me again from Washington. Scott, he defended the jury system, didn't defend it, praised it, said this is what the Manhattan District Attorney's office does every day. What did you take away from the Manhattan District Attorney?
First of all, the phrase he used, that the only voice that matters is the voice of the jury, because there are no shortage of voices in this case, after this case, before this case, and we're going to hear quite a bit from Trump and his supporters. The other thing that he says, which comes right out of that playbook, I guess, they hand you when you become a prosecutor, is when you're asked about what you're going to seek at sentencing, you say, I will speak through my court filings. Between now and some deadlines set for June and July, Alvin Bragg's team will speak through their filings, what type of sentence they're going to recommend in this case. It really is the overarching question we're stuck with now until July 11th. What type of penalty does Donald Trump face? The prosecutors get to make a recommendation. Most certainly the defense gets to make a recommendation. But just count me as dubious that you can etch that July 11th date into stone, John. 4 days before the Republican National Convention, any number of tactics, legal points of order Donald Trump can make to try to push that date back, he's likely to employ them if he sees fit to do so.
He certainly has in every other venue. Scott McFarland in Washington, thank you so much, Scott. Coming up, a special edition of America Decides. My colleague Caitlin Huey-Burns will have continuing coverage of Donald Trump's conviction on 34 felony counts.
On our places, bright, shiny faces.
When you wake up in the morning, we want to be your go-to team.
Nate has one of the quickest minds I've ever seen.
Tony has a way of making people feel comfortable.
Gail has this unbelievable knack to ask the question that you're asking at home.
I've been told I could talk to a tree, and that's pretty much true.
I don't go to work in the morning. I go for coffee with my two good friends, and we talk about the world.
Your morning routine just got better. CBS Mornings, weekdays at 7.
It didn't seem like anything could happen, because nothing ever happens in East Palestine, but it did.
Authorities released toxic fumes from 5 derailed train cars.
Resident, please evacuate.
Acute bronchitis due to chemical fumes.
Did you ever have these problems before the derailment?
No, ma'am.
This neighborhood's not safe no more.
We can assure the community that there's not vinyl chloride entering their communities.
Then why are there so many people feeling these various symptoms of bloody noses or difficulty breathing or bronchitis?
That's a hard question to answer.
We're talking about one of the most blatant releases of a mixture of some of the most toxic chemicals that we've seen in America.
I feel like now I have a duty to warn other communities. If my daughter has to watch me die of cancer, at least it saves someone else.
This case.
It's like a screenplay, something straight out of Hollywood.
But it's not fiction. It's 48 hours.
Human remains found this week.
4 families shattered.
There's no physical evidence.
The mystery would haunt investigators for years.
There's some questions that have to be asked and need to be answered.
Like a John Grisham novel.
A gripping true crime original. 48 hours. Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Stories that inform.
You can be really old at 60, and you can be really young at 85.
Inspire.
How do we unlock the power within ourselves to be who we want to be?
And brighten your day.
The best part of fame is making people feel good. Always send the people home happy.
Make every day a little more like Sunday morning.
Here comes the sun.
Stream now on the free CBS News app.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Dragon capsule here in space.
Sightseers in space, the thrill of a lifetime.
Seeing the Earth from space, it was so exhilarating.
But the risks that come with the territory.
There have been 4 fatal accidents. That's a 1% fatal accident rate.
Might make you look before you launch.
If you had 1 out of 100 airplanes falling out of the sky, we'd have a public crisis.
Space tourism, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
I'm John Dickerson. Join me for the Daily Report, weekdays on CBS News 24/7.
A CBS News investigation. People looking for love, finding their life savings gone.
This could happen to anybody.
And sometimes losing their lives. Anything for love. Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Hello, everyone. I'm Caitlin Huey-Burns in Washington. Welcome to a special edition of America Decides. We are following a historic development. Donald Trump has become the first former U.S. president to be convicted of felony crimes. A 12-person jury in New York City found the former president guilty of 34 counts of falsifying business records. They agreed with the prosecution that Trump falsified checks and records in order to prevent the public from learning about an alleged sexual encounter with adult film star Stormy Daniels. Former President Trump is scheduled to be sentenced on July 11th. Errol Barnett and Katrina Kaufman have been covering all of this inside and outside the courthouse for us all week. Thank you both for being here on this historic day. Errol, I want to start with you. Can you just walk us through what happened in that courtroom as the verdict was handed down?
Caitlin, it was only 11 hours of deliberation it took for these 12 New Yorkers to come to this unanimous decision. Today, inside the courtroom, there was a bizarre moment where, as we approached 4:30 p.m., the judge, Merchant, actually indicated that the jury may be dismissed for the day as people started to pack up. And then moments later, it became clear that there was another note from the jury, and that note was the verdict. The mood in the room shifted. Security started to get a bit more animated and telling people to be in place. And then Donald Trump had to be in the courtroom as the jury was returned to the courtroom, and the judge asked the foreperson if there had been a verdict, and if they were unanimous, that he affirmed that. And then one by one, the foreperson had to read the verdict on each of the 34 counts. So you can imagine the silence, the rapt attention in the room as again and again the foreperson said guilty, guilty, guilty. Donald Trump looking at each of these jurors, who none of them looked in his direction, as they confirmed by the judge that these were in fact their decisions, their unanimous decision, the historic decision to hold a former president accountable and effectively make him a felon. So that was the moment inside the courthouse. Outside, there was audible cheers from anti-Trump demonstrators who actually filled the street behind us a short time ago by the dozens as they tried to protest outside of the former president's motorcade. They were also joined by some pro-Trump demonstrators as well, which really kind of capped what has been 6 weeks of an intense trial and more than 20 witnesses and hundreds of pieces of evidence, which ultimately came down to 12 of Donald Trump's peers who have now decided his legal fate.
Yeah, Errol, and as you mentioned, this has been going on for 6 weeks, and we have had no cameras in the courtroom. There have not been any cameras allowed, so we have relied on your and Katrina and all of our colleagues reporting from inside the room to color that picture for us, which has been so valuable. And we actually heard from the former president, and as he was leaving court, Katrina, what did he say?
So he told reporters that the real verdict will come on November 5th when the election takes place. And he also reiterated that this is a corrupt judge and a rigged prosecution. He's already sent out a fundraising email and text proclaiming himself a political prisoner after being convicted in this trial. And it's hard to even convey. I was sitting right there in the courtroom when he walked out, and just the deep, deep worry on his face as he left that courtroom today. As the charges were being read, for a little bit, he even just sat there and closed his eyes before, as Errol was saying, looking at each juror as they validated that they were finding him guilty on all of these 34 charges.
And we understand, Errol, that Trump's legal team is going to appeal this decision. But what are the next steps in this case?
Yes, and you're seeing on your screen the actual charging sheet that each of the jurors had to work with to get to this unanimous decision. It is quite jarring when you see that key document right there. Well, we know, I mean, every step of the way, Donald Trump's defense team had pushed for a mistrial. They were not successful. If you remember, there were a number of gag orders placed on Trump, and ultimately he decided not to testify in his own defense, and the jury was told not to hold that against him. It's not a sign of guilt that everyone under the eyes of the law has that Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. So now we know that as Donald Trump exited after he crossed Katrina, who was in the main courtroom during that historic moment, he said that this was a disgrace. And he now is phrasing this as if he's a political prisoner. Of course, he was free to leave. And his campaign is also trying to fundraise off of this. Sentencing won't take place for a number of weeks. Judge Merchan has the discretion now to either keep that on the calendar as he made a date today, or to delay that during Trump's appeal. And a lot of our legal analysts and experts have suggested that a prison sentence is unlikely because this would be a first-time offense for Mr. Trump. He's elderly, he's a former president, so that gives him a distinguished kind of status in the eyes of the law. And so really the fact that he has been convicted on all 34 counts and is a felon is the headline and is stark enough. It's unlikely he will face jail time, but he is turning this now into his rallying call and campaign message.
Yeah, and Errol, it's fascinating because that sentencing date that the judge has laid out, at least at this point, is scheduled for July 11th, and that's just 4 days before the start of the Republican convention, in which Donald Trump will be officially nominated as his party's nominee. Katrina, you've been covering this case as a reporter for us, but you are also an attorney. So I'm curious, how you are seeing how this might impact his future criminal trials.
I mean, this particular verdict doesn't actually impact the other trials, but I think it is a very powerful moment. Donald Trump is someone who has always said he could, shoot someone on the street on Fifth Avenue and not be held criminally accountable. We're also still waiting for the determination by the Supreme Court whether he has presidential immunity regarding his D.C. election interference trial. And in that trial as well, they're trying to claim that essentially as president, you can get away with anything. And today proved that that is not true. Donald Trump is being held accountable, criminally charged. He is now going to be a convicted felon. And it also feels powerful. We're standing right by the courthouse where he was found guilty in the New York civil fraud case this fall, and also just down the street from where he also lost a case against E. Jean Carroll just a few months ago, and was hurt $91 million, the state $500 million. He now could potentially face prison time. It is unlikely, but an attorney, Norm Eisen, did an interesting study, an analysis of similar cases to this with this falsification of business records charge where it was elevated to a felony. And he found that in 1 out of 10 cases, they actually were given a prison sentence as a first-time offender. So it is on the table. I do think that Judge Juan Merchan has been very sensitive to the fact that Trump is a former president, a potential future president, and there's just no way that political impact can't come into play as well. But another thing to account for is that when sentencing happens, sometimes things like remorse come into play. And Donald Trump has in no way taken any responsibility for any of these crimes. He also had numerous gag order violations during this trial. He was held in contempt 10 times, and all of these things can weigh into that sentencing decision.
Yeah, as he exited the courtroom, it was striking to hear after he had just been found guilty on 34 counts that he declared that he was, quote, very innocent. Errol and Katrina, you have been covering this all for us for so long. We are so grateful for your reporting and giving us the scoop inside what it was like in that courtroom. Thank you. Let's get over to the White House now, where Ed O'Keefe is. I know you've been following all of this reaction from the Biden campaign. So how is President Biden reacting to this verdict, and do we expect to hear from him personally?
Caitlin, it's good to see you on what ranks as one of the more historic of historic days you and I and everyone else here has covered in recent years. But what I'm struck by is that there's been virtually no sign of the response to this verdict from here at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. That's in part because those outside, when the verdict was being read, didn't appear to know. The tourists that were out there, there were large groups of students, but there was no rush over here by people for or against the results that you might have expected or seen in the past. None of it. And that's partly because the president is not here today. He is at Rehoboth Beach, the Biden beach home there. The extended Biden family marking the 9th anniversary of the death of Beau Biden, who died of brain cancer 9 years ago today. This is always circled on the White House calendar as a day you don't bother the boss, that he is with his family, he is with Beau Biden's children. And so fate just delivered the verdict on this day, and it's a good reason to keep the president out of the limelight. We are not expected to hear from him in any shape or form tonight. The only comment from here at the White House came from the counsel's office, or the lawyers to the presidency, or who represent the president in legal matters when he's serving as president. And they said, quote, "We respect the rule of law and have no additional comment." A statement from the re-election campaign, a spokesman said in New York today, "We saw that no one is above the law. Donald Trump has always mistakenly believed he would never face consequences for breaking the law for his own personal gain." And the statement reminded Americans, quote, "Convicted felon or not, Trump will be the Republican nominee for president." Whether the president, the sitting president, decides to say anything more remains to be seen, and we'll have to wait until tomorrow. He is expected to come back for at least a few hours from his family time in Rehoboth Beach for meetings and for, of all things, a meeting tomorrow afternoon with the Kansas City Chiefs to mark their Super Bowl victory. Would he say something before that? There's certainly hours in the schedule right now that would allow for it, given that perhaps saying it with the Kansas City Chiefs behind him would seem a little improper. The other thing that's happened tonight pretty quickly is vigorous fundraising by both the Trump and Biden campaigns. The moment Donald Trump was walking out of the courtroom out into that infamous hallway to address the cameras, his campaign texted and emailed a statement to supporters saying, quote, "I am a political prisoner." Moments later, the president's campaign sent out a fundraising appeal saying there's only one way to keep Donald Trump out of the Oval Office, at the ballot box. Our producer, Bo Erickson, noted a few moments ago that they sent another fundraising appeal just in the last hour, and it kind of goads Biden supporters along, saying, quote, "If you have been waiting for the perfect time to make your first donation to Joe Biden's reelection campaign, we're here to tell you today is the day." Not trying to fundraise on behalf of either of these campaigns, but just to sort of convey to those of you who maybe don't get these what the political implications are. And what they are is both sides are trying to rally the troops and their base of support, understanding that now there are several months of campaigning to go.
Yeah, exactly, Ed. And we saw kind of a shift in terms of campaign surrogates for Biden going to the courthouse this week, Robert De Niro and others, to kind of make a political point here. So the political fallout of all of this for both candidates remains to be seen, but we will be following all of it. Ed O'Keefe, thank you. As you mentioned, we have been covering so much history together, but this is unlike any other day. We appreciate your time and reporting. Daniel Horowitz joins me now. He's a defense attorney and partner at McLaughlin Stern Law Firm. Good to see you. Thank you for being here. So you are a former assistant district attorney in the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. So I'm really curious, just given that experience, what do you make of this verdict?
I think it's a historic verdict, and it is a historic day for the Manhattan DA's office. Clearly an important case for all of the obvious reasons, but it had its challenges, and I think that the DA and his team did a masterful job in putting together a complicated case, but doing it in a way that there's a narrative that the jury could understand. A very simple story in a lot of ways, with a lot of complex moving parts. A simple story that Donald Trump is running for president. He's got news that's going to come out that's going to hurt his campaign and his chances to be president. And he conspires with David Pecker and Michael Cohen to come up with a scheme to suppress negative stories and to pay off the people who have the stories that could derail his campaign. It's a fairly simple narrative, had a lot of complex pieces to it. A lot of different kinds of evidence, documents, witnesses, tapes. It had witnesses like Michael Cohen, who, by his own admission, is almost a serial liar. But he was a serial liar who was hired by Donald Trump. And that's something that the DA was able to capitalize on.
Yeah, the strategy from the prosecutors here is seems obviously to have paid off in this case. I'm curious what you make of how the jury arrived to this decision in the amount of time that it did. They started deliberations yesterday, arrived at this conclusion today. What do you make of that timeline?
So it says one thing that's very simple. This was an extraordinarily strong case. And, as the media covered this case as it unfolded with witnesses like Stormy Daniels, a porn star, Michael Cohen, a convicted felon, David Pecker, the publisher of the National Enquirer, there's Keith Davidson, porn star's lawyer. You had a lot of sort of unseemly pieces to this that in the narrow sense on the day-to-day, okay, what happened today in court? Oh, gosh, the witness said this, and there was cross-examination, and the cross-examination might have been effective. But what the DA's team did at the end of the day is, in a masterful tour de force performance, the DA brings together, Josh Steinglass, brings together all these complex pieces in a narrative that the jury, as I said a minute ago, could understand. And the fact that the jury came back so quickly speaks to the strength of the case.
All right, Daniel Horowitz, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it. And we are going to go to Robert Costa now, who joins us also from outside the courthouse. Bob, you have been covering this since the very beginning. It has been a long trial, but this is not just a criminal conviction. This now goes into the political sphere and the fallout to come from this. Donald Trump is running for president. How is this going to affect him on the campaign trail? I mean, we saw him come out today and declare that he, in his words, is a very innocent man, declaring this as a rigged system. How do we expect him to move on politically?
Well, he's not going to move on politically. I've been speaking to sources close to former President Trump tonight, and it's evident that this is a seismic political and legal moment for Trump. Legally, he is going to begin the appeals process very soon and start to fight this in the courts. At the same time, he is going to use this conviction, 34 felony counts, to rally his base and to say to the Republican Party that, in his view, he was wrongly convicted, and he needs them to stand by him ahead of the Republican National Convention, which is just around the time he will be getting this prison sentence. This is a surreal moment for American politics and American democracy. You're going to have a presumptive Republican nominee enter the convention as a convicted felon facing possible jail time, while at the same time paying very little, if any, political cost with his own party. In fact, they're rallying to the political barricades right now on social media and on conservative media channels to say we stand with Trump. And that tells you about the summer of grievance that's ahead.
Yeah, Bob, I want to talk a little more about that, because you note, I mean, and we use this word all the time when it comes to Trump and everything that has happened and is to come, that, pretty much everything is unprecedented when it comes to Donald Trump and what he is doing here and facing here. But this is the first felony conviction of a former president. And you have been following this since the beginning. Give us a sense of, what it has been like there, what the reaction has been like to this.
The mood here in the park in Lower Manhattan for the past couple of hours has been one of almost stunned silence. There was a bit of cheers when the verdict was revealed, when the 34 guilty counts were announced inside the courthouse behind me. And then that quiet fell over the park here. This is a moment in America we haven't seen before, to use the word you chose, unprecedented, but it's also a test for the American people, the American political system. Because unlike, for example, past presidential moments where the country really saw scandal erupt, like Watergate in the 1970s, there's not a consensus now in the American political discourse about the rule of law, about the judicial system here in New York, or the justice system on a federal level. You have many Republicans aligned with Trump, believing, in their words, it's rigged, even though Trump was just tried by a jury of 12 New Yorkers, his peers. And many Democrats see Trump as a threat to democracy. Robert De Niro, the Academy Award-winning actor, I spoke to him a couple days ago, and he told me he came here because he really believes Trump is a threat to the order that was established by the Constitution and the Founding Fathers. So you have these diametrically opposed viewpoints, not just red and blue anymore. It's populism and nationalism versus almost traditional institutional thinking on a variety of fronts. And all of that is a cloud over the consequence of this trial. So this is a moment where there's uncertainty on the horizon, politically, legally, and in terms of American democracy.
Yeah, and Bob, as you are always right to remind us that we can assume nothing. So we will see what the fallout and consequences are politically in this election. Bob, we thank you very much. And congressional Republicans are already hammering this guilty verdict in Trump's criminal trial. We'll check in on Capitol Hill. You're streaming America Decides.
Coming up, our series. Wait a minute. Tom, is that you working the camera?
Keep leaning out of your close-up.
Your morning routine just got better. CBS Mornings, weekdays at 7.
I had progressively fallen deeper into the world of online sports betting.
The risk is the rush.
What do you think is driving the spike in popularity?
I think it's legality.
If it's legal, I'm going to use it. There are ways to bet when you are 18.
We've created an epidemic of child gambling.
You can't walk into a male dormitory in a college campus without sports betting happening.
It's America's most neglected problem.
I used sports betting as a way to escape, when in reality, I'm choosing self-destruction. Whatever I had left, it was gone.
The purpose of the industry is to get you to play to extinction. And that means until all your money is gone.
Go to the ends of the earth. Reach for the stars.
Yeah, I just took off. That kind of thing.
Oh, that's pretty good.
Because there's always something new under the sun on CBS Sunday morning.
An original documentary from CBS Reports.
That desired farm is a wonderful place to raise children, and it still is.
Promises broken.
Black Americans have been the target of racism and discrimination pretty much from the time they acquired ownership in the land.
Costing black farmers hundreds of billions in generational wealth.
They did everything to make sure we were run off that land.
But communities are uniting to continue the fight.
Collective ownership is powerful.
To keep their land and their dreams alive.
To watch my children play on land that we own means everything.
So land is power.
Most definitely.
40 Acres and a Mule, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
People with developmental disabilities were once sequestered by the hundreds of thousands in institutions.
Many of our fellow citizens are suffering tremendously because lack of attention, lack of imagination, lack of adequate manpower.
Disability activists have since torn down barriers blocking them from living at home or in the community.
We conclude that Title II of the ADA requires states to provide community-based treatment for persons with mental disabilities.
But of the 16,000 people who remain in state-operated institutions, half are in 5 states, and Illinois is one of them.
I don't want to live in the institution. It makes me feel discriminated against.
Do you think there are people living in institutions in Illinois
that don't need to be living there.
Yeah, because they're proving it as soon as they get out.
Republican congressional leadership has been critical of former President Donald Trump's guilty verdict. Our Scott McFarland joins us now to discuss. Scott, thank you for being here on this marathon day. So we had House Speaker Mike Johnson. Of course, he and almost all Republicans have been critical of this process. How is he reacting to this?
It just shows in the first couple of hours since the verdict that nothing seems to change the political calculus whatsoever, the trajectory on Donald Trump among his supporters. House Speaker Mike Johnson issued a statement which is symmetrical, parallel to so many other Republicans, saying the weaponization of our justice system has been a hallmark of the Biden administration, and the decision today is further evidence Democrats will stop at nothing to silence dissent and to crush their political opponents. We had several other statements from several other Republican leaders with a number of keywords, Caitlin: corrupt, rigged, weaponized, political. If that word cloud was created of the statements, you'd see those words at the center of it. Democrats leaning into the parallel argument, or the reflection of that argument, which is that this was the system working. This was citizens, the former president's peers, rendering a verdict. This was not the work of any political actors, certainly not the Biden administration.
Yeah, nobody is above the law in their words in a lot of those statements. We've seen kind of a parade of Republican allies outside the courthouse. Nearly every day he has had some kind of cohort of supporters outside the courthouse. Give us a sense of, what comes next for Republicans on Capitol Hill. Does this become part of a campaign argument? As you mentioned, they're really echoing Trump's campaign phrases.
These are Republicans who, first of all, not only synchronized their message outside the courthouse, but synchronized their clothing at one point outside the courthouse. It was a choreographed message, at least it seemed that way. But it also synchronizes with what they're doing on Capitol Hill as Republicans endeavor to continue their impeachment inquiry into President Biden, continue their investigation into Hunter Biden, and on Tuesday, called the U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland for questioning before one of the Republican-led House committees, with a keen focus, we suspect, on January 6th, on the prosecutions of Donald Trump through the special counsel, and on what's going on with Hunter Biden. So you have this political tonnage they're carrying and are poised to use and dump in the coming weeks.
And as you mentioned earlier, the sentencing for this conviction could come 4 days before the Republican National Convention. What are the stakes there?
Yeah. It's a July 11th sentencing hearing, 10 in the morning in Manhattan, a July 15th launch date to the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. The former date is not set in stone. We've seen sentencing hearings moved in many cases through the years. No reason to believe this one is firm and locked. It could shift, but if it doesn't, it certainly is an appetizer to what's about to happen on a stage in Milwaukee.
Yeah, nominating a convicted felon. It will be another history-making day, to be sure. Scott McFarland, thank you very much for your time. And if Donald Trump gets prison time, he'll have his Secret Service detail backing him up. Excuse me.
On our places, bright, shiny faces.
When you wake up in the morning, we want to be your go-to team. Nate has one of the quickest minds I've ever seen.
Tony has a way of making people feel comfortable.
Gailey has this unbelievable knack to ask the question that you're asking at home.
I've been told I could talk to a tree, and that's pretty much true.
I don't go to work in the morning. I go for coffee with my two good friends, and we talk about the world.
Your morning routine just got better. CBS Mornings, weekdays at 7.
It didn't seem like anything could happen, because nothing ever happens in East Palestine, but it did.
Authorities released toxic fumes from 5 derailed train cars.
Resident, please evacuate.
Acute bronchitis due to chemical fumes.
Did you ever have these problems before the derailment?
No, ma'am.
This neighborhood's not safe no more.
We can assure the community that there's not vinyl chloride entering their communities.
Then why are there so many people feeling these various symptoms of bloody noses or difficulty breathing, bronchitis?
That's a hard question to answer.
We're talking about one of the most blatant releases of a mixture of some of the most toxic chemicals that we've seen in America.
I feel like now I have a duty to warn other communities. If my daughter has to watch me die of cancer, at least it saves someone else. This case.
It's like a screenplay, something straight out of Hollywood.
But it's not fiction. It's 48 hours.
Human remains found this week.
4 families shattered.
There's no physical evidence.
The mystery would haunt investigators for years.
There's some questions that have to be asked and need to be answered.
Like a John Grisham novel.
A gripping true crime original. 48 hours. Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Stories that inform.
You can be really old at 60, and you can be really young at 85.
Inspire.
How do we unlock the power within ourselves to be who we want to be?
And brighten your day.
The best part of fame is making people feel good. Always send the people home happy.
Make every day a little more like Sunday morning.
Here comes the sun.
Stream now on the free CBS News app.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Dragon capsule here in space.
Sightseers in space, the thrill of a lifetime.
Seeing the Earth from space, it was so exhilarating.
But the risks that come with the territory.
There have been 4 fatal accidents. That's a 1% fatal accident rate.
Might make you look before you launch.
If you had 1 out of 100 airplanes falling out of the sky, we'd have a public crisis.
Space tourism, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
While this defendant may be unlike any other in American history, we arrived at this trial and ultimately today at this verdict in the same manner as every other case that comes through the courtroom doors, by following the facts and the law and doing so without fear or favor.
And welcome back to America Decides. We continue to cover this historic verdict in the former president's criminal trial out of New York. Donald Trump has been convicted on all 34 counts of falsifying business records. The former president will learn his sentence in July. Let's bring in John Dickerson, Major Garrett, and Jan Crawford. John is anchor of The Daily Report with John Dickerson and CBS News chief political analyst. Major is CBS News chief Washington correspondent, and Jan is CBS News chief legal correspondent. A lot of chiefs here. Thank you all. John, I want to start with you because we have talked all afternoon about this historic moment that we have here. But walk us through, as you do best, the real gravity of what we have just learned.
Well, in 237 years of the American presidency and 46 men who've held that job, one has never been a convicted felon. So that sets the stakes right there. I think that the real gravity that is on my mind right now is that, Donald Trump is now not just convicted, but he is also the Republican nominee, and there's an election underway, and there is a Veep stakes underway, and the incentives of politics are to run down and denigrate the legal system. That's not to say that Donald Trump, like every other person, isn't allowed his chance to appeal and that there might not be grounds for appeal. But to go so far, as some of his supporters are doing, and make the groundless accusation that Joe Biden is, involved in this in some way, echoes the same kinds of baseless claims that were made after the 2020 election, which Donald Trump lost. And when those baseless claims are made, that the system is rigged, people who are of a mind to operate and take things into their own hands, when that kind of prodding is given to them, they take things into their own hands. And I am concerned now about how people who should be stewards of the system, of the constitutional system, how they will react in political terms that exacerbates the violent responses that we've seen in our politics, obviously most notably on January 6th.
Yeah, Major, to that point, we have seen Donald Trump be able to evade political consequences. legal consequences up until now. Today changes that.
Today changes that in a legal context. The former president said that won't matter on November 5th because I will give my answer and my voters and supporters will give their answer and reelect me. My legal answer is a political answer. And for the better part of the weeks that this has been proceeding in New York, former president has availed himself of every opportunity to, as John said, criticize, if not denigrate, the legal system and make a political plea. I am being persecuted. I am being singled out. And many of his Republican supporters look at the judge and say there are Democratic connections there, financial and otherwise, to candidates, or the prosecutors. What they haven't said, however, and all those things are true, that doesn't mean this case is illegitimately brought, but they are points of political conversation that have a legitimacy to them. But what they don't say is evidence submitted before the jurors was fraudulent. Those checks aren't made up. The checks that have Donald Trump's signature on them, and the testimony of one of his closest friends, David Pecker, who ran the National Enquirer, was emphatic. We talked about it. We launched this. This was a scheme. This was to influence the election, and I was part of it. The critics of this process are not assailing either those checks or that evidentiary pattern the prosecutors laid before the jury or the most relevant and compelling testimony about what those checks represented. And that's one of the things that's going to persist as we debate what this verdict does or doesn't mean. The former president and his Republican supporters will say it means that the justice system is completely unraveling. Those who support this verdict will say, wait a minute, what's the evidence say? Are you contesting the evidence? And until Republicans start actually contesting that evidence, I think they are going to have to acknowledge they are not on as firm legal footing as they might think.
And you know, this happened in the context of a legal proceeding. As much as the former president and allies are describing this as a political theater, it was not. This is a jury of 12 people, Jan, a jury of the former president's peers. How do you imagine that they arrived at this decision? Unanimous on all counts.
And swiftly.
Yeah.
I mean, that, you know, that's, I think, can't be overstated how quick this verdict came down after they took, obviously, quite thorough looks at testimony and had instructions reread. You know, and the jurors, the judge has said that they're free to talk. So we're all going to eagerly be waiting what some jurors choose to say or not about how they did reach this verdict. I mean, it was a New York jury coming from all walks of life, as New York is. You had 2 lawyers, you had people from a variety of jobs who get their news from a variety of sources. What you're going to see and what we've already seen from Trump and his allies is that this is a New York jury in a state that in an area that goes overwhelmingly Democratic, and that will play well to his base and in certain swing states. And I think one of the things that, we now have this first ever conviction of a president, of a presidential candidate. He is a convicted felon, but this was just one of 4 potential trials that he could have faced. And, to that extent, yes, this is a run-of-the-mill business trial. Some people equated it to, prosecuting Al Capone on tax evasion charges, so he is convicted. But there were other cases that I thought were more, and, the timing-wise, this is the one that came up first. But, you had the classified documents case in Florida. You had the prosecution by the special counsel, Jack Smith, for the actions, which are on video and phone calls, for January 6th and efforts to overturn the 2020 election. Those allegations are in some ways easier to get your hands around, to say, like, the severity of this. Right. That, yes, we can see the consequences of trying to overturn an election. Yes, classified documents need to remain classified for a reason, and it is in Florida, which is not New York, obviously. So I think you're going to see in the days ahead efforts, and we've already seen it, to undermine not only this indictment, this prosecution, this jury, this judge, and there will be people who believe that. And that goes to, I think, what John is also saying, that we're in a moment in this country where the legitimacy of our institutions has been under attack, often by Donald Trump, and people's faith in those institutions is eroding. And I think in some ways that's a very troubling moment, in addition to the specter of violence and the other things that John pointed out. That's a troubling moment for our country.
Absolutely. We have to leave it there, but John, Major, Jan, thank you for the context, the analysis, and the reporting on this historic day. We appreciate it. And this verdict could have major implications for Donald Trump's re-election bid. Our CBS News political director will have an update on where things stand and the reaction from Trump's inner circle. You're streaming America Decides.
Washington is the seat of power. National security, foreign policy, global economics, every story comes through Washington in some way. We bring some of the most powerful voices in America to the table. We don't just ask the questions, you have to go deeper. We try to understand what's at the heart of the issue we're talking about, to then come forward with solutions.
Face the Nation on CBS.
The justices ruled that Harvard and the University of North Carolina violated the Constitution.
In the aftermath of the Supreme Court decision to end affirmative action in college admissions, uncertainty sets in for some students of color.
Affirmative action really gave us an equal opportunity.
CBS Reports explores the historic decision and what it means for those chasing an opportunity to change their lives.
I knew that college was the ticket to break this cycle.
The end of affirmative action, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Okay, let's go. You guys good?
Hey.
All right, we good?
Keep going. The clock, it's ticking.
Off we go.
60 minutes. 60 minutes.
60 minutes.
It's time for 60 Minutes, Sundays on CBS.
An original documentary from CBS Reports.
AI is among the most world-changing technologies ever.
Curing diseases, scientific breakthroughs, making lives better.
They can help us with medical discoveries, scientific discoveries, doing better agriculture, having cures for things like Alzheimer's.
It's also going to really transform the way we work.
The uplifting potential of artificial intelligence is limitless.
It gives you a friend, somebody to chat with 24/7 that is non-judgmental. He makes me feel loved and desired.
And so are its downfalls.
The problem with all this AI is that it's unpredictable and uncontrollable. The choices we make now will have lasting effects for decades, maybe even centuries.
The ChatGPT revolution, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
We are about to see American weapons in the hands of Mexican cartels.
A gun pipeline to Mexico.
We are arming the cartels.
100%, no doubt about it.
Happening right under our noses.
Who's doing something about this? Nobody.
A CBS Reports exclusive.
Most Americans have no idea that we are effectively arming the enemy next door.
This is the story the American people need to know.
Arming cartels, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
America Decides, taking you inside American democracy.
The most important stories on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis.
You're going to hear a lot of reporting.
It is clearly a pivotal moment.
Gun control, the economy, education.
Both sides of the political aisle fight it out for power.
Bringing you the analysis that you need.
Thoughtfully, with context.
Be part of the conversation.
On CBS News streaming.
Welcome to America Decides, Monday through Thursday at 5 p.m. Eastern.
The verdict in former President Trump's criminal trial could have a major impact on the presidential race. After the jury made its decision, Trump said, quote, "The real verdict is going to be November 5th. CBS News political director Finn Gomez joins us now for more. Finn, great to see you. This is a day unlike any other. We have been saying that all the time when it comes to Donald Trump, but this really is a day that we just haven't seen. He is the presumptive nominee of the Republican Party, and yet now is officially a convicted felon. What are you hearing from Trump's inner circle about how they're feeling about this verdict?
Hi, CHB. Yeah, so I've spoken to several people in the Trump campaign, and also close Trump allies. Their sense, my understanding from speaking with them, is that they feel that this actually will help the former president politically, that it will help him because his base is fired up. They're motivated. They feel that this is they believe the narrative that he has been saying every day at 100 Center Street down there at the courthouse. that this is a political witch hunt. They believe that narrative, but they also believe that this will boost him. They feel that this will that especially that foundational structure. If you look at his support, that coalition that makes his 2024 base support, that they will be fueled by this, that they will be going out into the polls, that they will be essentially fired up and will be very active.
And Finn, do you have a sense from them about whether this could potentially, whether they see this as not only animating their own base, which is, of course, going to be riled up for him, but whether it might convert anyone in the middle?
Well, we did see some polling, Caitlin, just this week that showed from NewsHour and their poll showed that actually most people believe that this wouldn't really impact their decision on how they will vote on November 5th. However, the amount of attention, the amount of national and global attention this unprecedented conviction is getting, as you referenced, CHB, this is the first time we've ever seen a presumptive nominee, a former president, convicted in a criminal trial. And this, for those that I've spoken to who are aligned with President Biden and his campaign, they have told me that, frankly, they believe that this will help the other side, will help them politically. Well, if you look at those who will now be paying attention, perhaps let's take there's been a lot of attention on that Nikki Haley supporter that we saw, who's sort of still questioning whether they will support Trump or not. People close to the campaign, to the Biden campaign, tell me they believe that this will help them with that voter. That would help them in those 7 battleground states that we've been paying attention to, that could decide this race. And for those Biden Democrats that I've spoken to, they think this will help them pull some of those Haley voters into their camp.
Yeah, Finn, you make a really good and important point, which is that all of this has been a hypothetical. So now that it is reality, how do voters assess that? And we will be talking to a lot of them over the next several months to assess their feelings about all of this. Finn Gomez, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let's go now to A.T. Smith. He's the former Deputy Director of the Secret Service. A.T., it's great to see you. Thank you so much for being here. So I want to talk about the possibility of jail time for the former president. Most legal analysts we've talked to have said that they really doubt that any jail time would be administered for the former president, given the circumstances. But if that were to be the case, if he was sentenced to jail, what would that look like, given that he would be under Secret Service protection?
Well, at the end of the day, the Secret Service will work through whatever the parameters are issued by the judge in order to make things work from a protective standpoint, because, under the law, President Trump is still entitled to Secret Service protection. So whether that were an incarceration scenario or house arrest or simply probation, they will work with the court officials to make sure that the security needs will be met, but at the same time that the issuance and so forth of the orders of the court will be adhered to. And I know that for a specific reason, the Secret Service did not engage in any pre-conversations, if you will, about what might happen today if incarceration were ordered. They didn't want any leaks or any sort of signal sent that would be wrong or erroneous. And I know that having said that, during the time that the gag order violations were an issue, the service did have some conversations about what if, and in that scenario, there were several things put on the table, whether it's the VIP section of Rikers or even to some degree, there's a VIP detention ward at Bellevue Hospital, or certainly, house incarceration or house arrest at Trump Tower. So there were a lot of things discussed, not in the context of this, but in the context of the gag order. But at the end of the day, and the Secret Service has put out a statement today saying that they will adhere to the orders of the judge, but at the same time, they will carry out their mission as they always do.
Yeah, and regardless of what happens with the sentencing, there must be a heightened sense of alert in terms of potential threats to the former president, especially now that he is a convicted felon.
That will take a couple of days to see, but as you can see from today's events, the NYPD enhanced their security perimeter around the courthouse very quickly because of the verdict, I think. But at the same time, the Secret Service will work with its state and local partners wherever the former president may go to make sure that the security needs are met. In terms of threat analysis and the intelligence there, it will take a day or so to discern that. Normally, events may drive the threat level up a little, but then, once those things are investigated over a matter of days, they tend to flatten out again. So we'll just have to wait and see, and the Secret Service will take a hard look at that over the next few days to see what kind of threats come in, both pro and con for that matter, to see what sort of evaluation they need to do, and that plays into the enhancement of security at any venue that they may go to.
All right, we will keep an eye out for that, certainly. A.T. Smith, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
And reaction to the Donald Trump verdict is still coming in. We'll talk to CBS News election law contributor David Becker about what precedent this case sets and the possibility of political violence. Stay with us.
Go to the ends of the earth.
Right now, we got something crazy.
And reach for the stars.
Here we are.
Time.
Yes, it's my comeback.
Hey, this is pretty fun. But wait, there's more.
Experience thought-provoking.
Welcome to the idea of being a human being.
Innovative and truly original reporting.
Look through a telescope and go, wow.
Because there's always something new under the sun on CBS Sunday morning.
At this moment, terrorists could be plotting another attack.
9/11 triggered a counter-terrorist system that included a secret database.
This person needs a closer look.
A growing list of nearly 2 million people, including some Americans who say they're innocent.
On 1 hour flight, I have to spend 6 hours to go and come back.
CBS Reports explores the system, the people responsible for it, and those pushing for change.
I'm not fighting against them. I'm fighting for them to do the right thing.
The Watch List, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Don't miss true crime anytime you want, anywhere you go. With the 48 Hours podcast. Real crimes, real lives, real justice.
There's some questions that have to be asked and need to be answered.
Listen to 48 Hours on Apple Podcasts.
An original documentary from CBS Reports.
Imagine yourself in Manhattan with no police, no army, no mayor.
The people of Haiti stare down poverty, corruption, natural disasters, and violence.
90% of the guns that are used by gangs in Haiti are American guns.
But with an unbreakable spirit and eternal optimism.
There are days where I cry, but we can't be discouraged. We still believe in Haiti.
They're still able to look ahead with hope.
Haiti is on the brink of transformation, a radical shift. Haitians are coming together and saying things must change.
Fighting for Haiti, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Hey there, welcome to The Uplift.
I thought she was a groom, and I stepped back and I went, oh, you're the queen. She's going to be with me every instant that I'm alive.
I just wanted to see if you'd go to Disneyland with me today.
I look over at him and he's smiling.
I'm going to remember that the rest of my life.
They told us when he was going to be born, he was only going to live for 30 minutes. It's really a miracle that he's with us today.
The Uplift. Stream now on the free CBS News app.
When you wake up in the morning, we want to be your go-to team.
On our places, bright, shiny faces.
I don't go to work in the morning. I go for coffee with my two good friends, and we talk about the world.
Your morning routine just got better. CBS Mornings.
A CBS News investigation. People looking for love, finding their life savings gone.
This could happen to anybody.
And sometimes losing their lives. Anything for love. Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
For the first time in American history, a former president has been found guilty in criminal court. CBS News election law contributor David Becker joins us now. David, good to see you. Thanks for being here. So we have never been here before. Talk to us about the precedent that this case sets.
Well, it's historic. As you've noted and many others have commented, we've never had a former president convicted of a felony before. We knew this was likely coming. There were multiple cases in the works. This is the first one that got there. But this could have an impact, not just on the election and how we choose our next president, but on how people respond to institutions and our democracy overall. One of the things that I'm keeping a close eye on is whether or not this might cause the minority of Americans who will believe the claims that this was rigged and this was a Biden prosecution, both of which are false, and who might be inclined to get angry because they support Donald Trump, whether this might lead to political violence over the next several months. But I'm also struck by how resilient our institutions are. This is remarkable. In our nation's history, we might never have been challenged as much as we have been since the Civil War, and yet our institutions, whether it be election officials and our election system, which have responded remarkably over the course of time, or our court system, which has responded remarkably. Scott McFarland made a great point a few hours ago about how the jurors on this trial undoubtedly knew that they would be attacked if they convicted him, much as the judge and his family had been attacked. And yet they still looked at the evidence, looked at the law, and did their duty. And our institutions, once again, have been resilient against attacks.
Yeah, and that's important to note, especially with these potential threats of political violence, especially given how Trump supporters have shown that they're willing to stand up for him. I'm curious, too, I mean, now that the former president is a convicted felon, he's also the presumptive Republican nominee. He is going to be nominated as the party's nominee in July. Can he still vote as a convicted felon?
Yeah, that's a great point. I've been getting that question a lot recently. It is undoubtedly true that he is going to be the Republican nominee. He is going to run. He can take office despite this conviction. His right to vote, he's currently a Florida voter, is going to be subject to Florida law. And what Florida law says is that if you are a convicted felon, you are subject to the laws of that state with regard to the felony conviction, in this case in New York. And in New York, you're eligible to vote so long as you are not currently incarcerated. So he is extremely unlikely, almost a 0% chance of him being incarcerated by November. So it's almost certain that he will still be eligible to vote under Florida law.
All right, that is important clarity for us, and we will wait that sentencing scheduled for July 11th, just days before the political convention for the Republicans. David Becker, as always, we thank you.
Thank you, Caitlin.
And that does it for us here today. You've been watching a special edition of America Decides. John Dickerson picks up our coverage next with the Daily Report. I'm Caitlin Huey-Burns.
Okay, so let's just start at the beginning.
Well, let me start with this. What is at stake here?
What is the answer then?
Do you know why?
You want me to just keep going?
Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Were there death threats?
How is this possible?
What's wrong with that argument?
Are you saying they lied?
Have you told the government that?
Why won't you say the word crisis?
You're not answering my question.
This really
Is that scary?
Does that make sense?
What do you mean?
What does that mean?
Did any of that make sense?
What's your response?
What happened?
Why?
It's time for the CBS News Original 60 Minutes, Sunday on CBS and streaming on Paramount+.
There is no more room in our city.
New York City is receiving record numbers of migrants.
Today, we're going to have more than 500 adults and children come through that door.
Tensions rise as shelters reach max capacity.
We don't have to take care of them.
CBS Reports goes inside a crisis cities and families are facing as they fight to survive.
The United States still has that glimmer of hope for people to come here.
Fighting for a future. Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
On Face the Nation, the way to learn is to listen.
We may have a recession.
Listening to how someone explains themselves is so key to understanding their perspective.
an original documentary from CBS Reports.
Since you started La Soup in 2014, do you have any sense as to how much food you've rescued from the landfill?
We've rescued 4.5 million pounds.
I can't even fathom how much food that is.
And that's one little person in one little city in America. We're going to call this chicken piccata. We did 450 of these meals today.
This is the exact dish that you and I are going to have.
Yep.
Oh, really good.
Is it good?
Mm-hmm.
Having a plan of how to keep people fed should be in every single city.
If we eliminated food waste, could we eliminate
hunger? Yes.
Eating Trash, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
America Decides, taking you inside American democracy.
the most important stories on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis?
You're going to hear a lot of reporting.
It is clearly a pivotal moment.
Gun control, the economy, education.
Both sides of the political aisle fight it out for power.
Bringing you the analysis that you need.
Thoughtfully, with context.
Be part of the conversation.
On CBS News streaming.
Welcome to America Decides.
When people say who's first to get in the morning, that would be me. Morning news matters because it sets the tone for your day, and it's a way of getting you started.
Day to day, that first draft of history, it happens right here.
We're going to uplift you. We're going to send you out your way.
We take you places, we teach you new things, and we make you feel like, you know, it's not all bad.
People say to me, you always seem to be having a good time. And you know what? You're right.
Your morning routine just got better. CBS Mornings, weekdays at 7.
I'm John Dickerson. Join me for the Daily Report, weekdays on CBS News 24/7.
A CBS News investigation. People looking for love, finding their life savings gone,
This could happen to anybody.
and sometimes losing their lives. Anything for love. Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Your Holiness, what an honor. So wonderful to meet you.
What's it like to have a conversation with a pope? You're about to find out.
When you look at the world, what gives you